they viewed it as evil. Mind rape they called it, saying that the blackness of the eyes of the possessed reflected the evil in the heart of the possessor, in having no concern for their victim. It was also said to be detrimental to the mind of the possessor, Daisy added, pointing to a line of text. The spell destabilized the mind. Tyrion read and winced a little. Ah yes. So, an evil spell that sends the person who casts it a little mad. Of course. And as the years went by and the Valyrians conquered more and more land and imposed their rule on people, they also changed their minds with regard to the spell. It was only evil if used by a Valyrian on a fellow Valyrian. If used on a non-Valyrian, that was perfectly alright because the Valyrians were automatically better than everyone else. He closed the book carefully and then stared at his hands as if they were now dirty. Fortunately Daisy pulled out a damp cloth. She knew him rather well by now. Did anyone ever mourn the Valyrians? Catelyn Stark asked with a scowl. How could anyone mourn such a people? Tyrion thought of Gogossos and the rumors of the things that had been made there and shivered a little. They worshipped power, he said almost absently as he thought things through. They did things not because they should do those things but because they could. Given what the Green Man said about them, it's no wonder that Valyria was destroyed eventually. They bent magic until it broke. There was a short and worried silence, until Tyrion finally sighed and leant back in his chair. So, Sir Gregor Clegane was possessed with the aid of a Valyrian spell. The question we now need to ask ourselves is how? And who? Where did this unknown person get the information needed to perform this twisted piece of magic, and why did they do it? And what did they mean by saying that Robb was the wrong Stark? The Targaryens never seemed to have had access to this magic, Daisy said thoughtfully. Otherwise they could have conquered without the Field of Fire or the Last Storm. Or the burning of Harrenhal, come to that. There would have been no need for the Dance of Dragons or the Black Fur revolts. I have been thinking about this most carefully, Lewyn said quietly. And one thing does come to mind: the voyage of your uncle, Lord Tyrion, into the Smoking Sea. Sir Gerion spoke of that crag, with the ruins and the mad ancient Valyrian and his twisted magics. That crag was destroyed utterly. But what if there were, more ruins with roofs, protected by the elements, with knowledge of Valyrian magic buried within them? Valyria itself is inaccessible. But if your uncle got close enough to see its ruined towers, could others have done the same? And accessed knowledge of, he gestured in disgust at the book. Such things. Someone who wanted to kill a Stark, Robb said flatly, and Tyrion noted that Val reached for his hand. Ah. Interesting. But not me. So who then? Father? Jon? We cannot easily warn them, Lewyn scowled. A raven to Old Town will have to be dispatched at once, but both Lord Stark and Jon will be at sea by now and there can be no warning. And what if it's not them this unknown enemy is after? Lady Stark said with a quaver in her voice. What if it's Bran, or Rickon, or the girls? Or even her hands went to her swollen stomach. The babe. Sandor Clegane said that his brother had been complaining about nightmares and a feeling of oppression. Tyrion mused thoughtfully. What were his words again? Something dark is coming. I suggest that everyone in Winterfell be alerted to this. Yes, there will be a lot of chaff in the wind from people complaining about their dreams, but some might stand out as being singular. In the meantime I will wear the warnings every day. You all saw their reaction to the body of the mountain. They should do the same to anyone else who is possessed. If we are vigilant, then we will be able to spot this early enough to take action. He paused. And we need send word to Benjen Stark. The mountain was supposed to ride with my father to the wall. He might be in danger as well. Jon Arryn. He stood there on the road that led to the dragon pit and sighed for a moment as he caught his breath. He was mostly recovered, but he could feel the Uri calling him home. He wanted to go home, to the halls of his ancestors, and organize the Vale to meet the coming storm. But he had too much to do first. That said, at least the ships were gone. One less thing to worry about. Every time he saw Blackwater Bay he wondered where that little fleet of ships were now. Every time a raven message from the Vale or the northeastern parts of the Crown Lands came he girded himself a little for bad news. But so far none had arrived. No word of smoke on the horizon, no word of a great flash and a noise like 1,000 thunders. Before he had left with the ships, Sir Davos Seaworth had told him wryly that word had gone out about the fleet and that every pirate and sell sail out there would give the ships a very wide berth indeed. Apparently even Salad Horsaran had announced that anyone who tried to seize those ships for the wildfire was a lunatic. Strictly speaking, the wildfire was priceless. Practically speaking, anyone who tried to seize it was, indeed, a lunatic. He would long remember the day that the little fleet had set sail. What seemed like half of King's Landing had been there at the docks to watch them leave, a huge crowd that had been strangely silent. Everyone wanted that wretched stuff gone. Oh, and according to Quill, the other half of the population of the city had been at the other end of the city, hiding in cellars. He still wasn't sure which group had been the wiser. What he was sure about, however, was that any residual loyalty to the Targaryens was now at a very low ebb, not even a war member. He'd had a very quiet and unofficial word with Lord Valerian about this, who had told him that he'd heard no names, of course, that a few houses with ties of affection and loyalty to the old royal family had recently pulled out certain banners and burned them. He suspected who had done so and why. Well, water under the bridge and a few names to take a note of. Not that there was any chance of Daenerys Targaryen returning to King's Landing. Her disappearance concerned him. It was far better when she was in one place, where someone could keep an eye on her, especially after she had somehow hatched 3 bloody dragons. The moment that he had heard of that stupendous piece of news, a chill had run through him, and that chill was still there whenever he thought of those dragons. They were important, he knew that somehow. Which was why, as he turned towards the dragon pit and started walking again, he'd ordered that it be cleared of the rubble that had choked it since the dance of the dragons and the storming of the dragon pit itself, not to mention the damage from the wildfire that had been used in it to incinerate the bodies of those who had died in the Great Spring Sickness. The dome was beyond repair, but it had always irritated him that the place was disused. At the very least, the stones that had fallen could be extracted and used to repair and rebuild other homes in the city. He found Quill and, oddly enough, Pycelle at the main gates. There were also a number of guards who were watching over the workmen that were coming and going from the dragon pit bearing stones, some blackened and others misshaped. Your message was highly enigmatic, Quill. Grand Maester, I did not know that you were here too. The old man harumphed a little and then gestured at the dome. My lord, I was here to observe the work and look at the dome. A magnificent piece of architecture, although one that is somewhat desolate at the moment. Not to mention fragile in places. I felt that certain spots should be out of bounds, in case the arches were weakened by the removal of the rubble. He nodded, conceding the point, before turning back to Quill, who had a peculiar look to his face. My lord, we found a group of bodies on one of the upper areas. Not one of the areas covered in the ash from the bodies of the Great Spring Sickness, a higher area than that. Rubble from the roof had killed them all, and they were nothing but bones, but some were in armor. And one of them, well, you need to see this, my lord. And with that he led them into the building. As they passed through the vast doors that had been sealed for so long, Jon found himself shivering a little as they passed from the sunlight into the darkened interior. Yes, the shattered dome let in light, but he had a feeling that it was more than the absence of direct sunlight that had made him shiver. Terrible things had happened in here. Creatures almost out of legend had lived in here and had died, along with untold numbers of men and women. And then Aerys Targaryen had come so close to killing the entire city, with a huge cache of wildfire buried in here. It was all gone now, he was sure of it, but he still shuddered a little at the thought of it. To think that he owed his life and the lives of so many others, including Ned and thousands of their men, to Jaime Lannister. Aerys, he remembered the first time he had met the then young king, back when he was merely excitable and full of promise. So many ideas, that should have been the clue that all was not well with the man. Projects had come tumbling from his lips as he went from idea to idea, like a frog jumping from lillipad to lillipad, never returning to the same place. And then had come dusk and ale. When the mirror had been shattered and Aerys had descended into madness, from which he had never returned. Had Robert's rebellion been inevitable? What if Rhaegar had been able to go through with his plan to replace his father, as had been hinted at in the run-up to the Great Tourney at Harrenhal? No, more than hinted at. But instead Rhaegar had veered off into his own form of madness. As they passed by a section of one ruined wall, he glanced around again. The Targaryens had once held the realm in the palm of their hands, creating marvels such as this, as it had been when first built centuries ago. And now they were reduced to one old man on the wall and a vanished girl. It was a lesson that kings needed to be taught. That Robert seemed to be finally learning. There were guards around the section that Quill had guided them to. They nodded to him as they arrived, and he looked at Quill, who gestured at a patch of rubble that seemed to be different. There were indeed bodies there, albeit skeletons, some in rags. But there was one in armor. Ruined armor. He knew it at a glance, even though it was covered in dust and pieces of debris. That was the armor of a Royce of Runestone, which meant that this could only be one man. Sir William Royce. I thought, he said thickly, before coughing. I thought that Sir William Royce died out there, in the city, when the Seven that rode tried to retrieve Prince Joffrey Valerian's body. How could he be in here? There is a door over there that leads to the street, my lord, Quill muttered, pointing to a rubble-choked passageway. I think that he fought his way down here against the mob and then died here, along with as many of them as he could kill. And then afterwards, when the dome was cracked and fell in, the body was covered in rubble. My lord, this was next to the body. And with that he pulled out a sword that had been hidden by a piece of rough tarpaulin. He felt his scalp crawl as he looked at it. It was, he could tell at a glance, Valyrian steel. And there was a scabbard next to it that had a bronze sheath, green with age and covered in runes as well. Lamentation, he whispered. The sword of House Royce. So it would seem, Pycelle said in a thoughtful voice. Most providential, given the current need for such swords. Well, my lord, it would seem that Lord Royce will be most happy with this news. Bronze bloody Yone would probably turn the air blue around him as he greeted the sword of his ancestors with excitement. Well, that was what he wanted to say but did not. But there was something else, as Quill seemed to be nervous about something. Quill. What's wrong? The Valyman coughed slightly. This, my lord. And with that he took a small rag, dipped it into the bucket that John hadn't noticed to one side, and then drew it across the armor of Sir William Royce. John frowned and then blinked as he saw that the runes on the armor, or at least some of them, were glowing. He stared. So did Pycelle. Grand Maester, he said eventually, I am well versed in my history, and none of what I have ever read about the Seven who rode say anything about Sir William Royce's armor ever glowing. Pycelle harumphed for a moment, before starting to mutter something about certain types of phosphorescence in seawater, and then bumbling to a perplexed halt. I do not know, my lord, he confessed after a long moment. It is peculiar. Quill raised an eyebrow at John and then scattered some more dirt over the armor. A question for another time perhaps, my lord, Grand Maester. He looked down at the body in the armor, or rather the bones of the body. We will take up his bones and his armor with all due respect for one of the Seven who rode. They observed quietly as a litter was brought up and remains transferred onto it, and then they walked back to the great gates, with John carrying Lamentation himself. There was no chance of him letting it out of his sight until it was sent on to Bronze Yone. He owed the man at least that. And while he had no doubt whatsoever of the loyalty of the Lord of Runestone, it would never hurt to tie the houses of Arryn and Royce further together with more debts of honor and obligation. And it was there that they encountered a small party of horsemen, with a small carriage that was almost one of those newish gigs next to them. My lord, said one of the horsemen, and then as the man dismounted and formally bowed to him, he realized that it was Broncastle, and his breath caught for a moment in his chest as he realized why the man was here. Lord Castle, he replied easily. Welcome to King's Landing again. Bronn smiled easily. Thank you, my lord. He paused and seemed to notice the litter with the armor and the bones. Ah. Interesting. He turned his attention back to John. My apologies, my lord. If you are returning to the Red Keep, perhaps we might accompany you. You too, Grand Maester. Pycelle harumphed quite a bit at that, but after John turned and looked at him, the older man seemed, and how much of that was real. To put two and two together before nodding. As they mounted their respective horses, John raised an eyebrow at Bronn. There was a shorter guard to one side who had a shield strapped to his back and who seemed to be hovering near the Lord of the Foxhold. John squinted a bit. The guard had the look of old Geordie Corlish, and the shield was of an ancient design. There was something odd going on here. He wanted to gallop to the Red Keep, but that would have told anyone around him that something was truly concerning him, so instead they trotted as he discussed the matters of the day with the former sellsword who was now a lord in the Vale. Bronn chatted easily back to him, talking about the state of the road, the varied people who were heading north in answer to the call and other matters. At no point did the words "Do you have my murderous, treacherous, wife in that carriage" leave Jon's lips. The moment that the gates of the Red Keep clanged shut behind them and he could see the Tower of the Hand, he let out a sigh of relieved tension and dismounted. "Bronn, I take it that you have my wife with you?" "Aye, my lord," Bronn said, walking over to the carriage. Oddly enough it was empty, but then Jon noticed that the underside of it was quite deep. Bronn pulled out a tool and levered a section open, and then some of his men pulled out a very large wooden box, one big enough to contain a person. They laid it on the ground and then opened it. Inside the very deeply padded interior was the sleeping figure of Lysa. His breath caught in his throat as he laid eyes on her. The last time he had seen her she had been trying to kill him. The months that had passed since then had not been kind to her. She was thinner than before, with lines on her face that he had never seen previously. And of course she was missing an arm. He stared at her for a long moment, warring emotions rippling through him. She was the mother to his only son. A son that she had poisoned for reasons that eluded him. To make him dependent on her. To bind him closer to her. She'd been breastfeeding him for far too long. How long had she been unsound in her mind, and how had he missed it? How had he missed her connection with Baelish come to that? And she had tried to murder him in vengeance of the thief of the smallest of the fingers. "I take it that she is dosed with the milk of the poppy." The words were harsh in his own ear, the strain all too evident. Bronn nodded. "If I may, my lord." Pycelle said the words with a surprising gentleness. After receiving his nod, the maester inspected her, peeling back an eyelid briefly before examining the stump where her arm used to be. After a long moment he straightened up and nodded appraisingly. "Lord Castle, your maester is most skilled, and please pass on my compliments to him." Her arm was removed very skillfully and her life saved. He looked at Jon. "She is well, my lord. Well enough to stand trial." Pycelle pursed his lips for a moment as he considered the matter. "I would need to examine her when she was awake to provide you with a full, evaluation, my lord. Given her, earlier instabilities, I cannot say at this time." Jon stared down at his wife for a long moment before nodding wearily. "Quill." "My lord. She is to be taken to a secure room in the Red Keep. An internal room, no window or balcony. And she is to be guarded at all times. She will live to stand trial, Quill." The Valuman bowed. "It will be as you say, my lord." Jon looked back at Bronn, who was standing with that guard with the archaic shield again. He tilted his head as he made the connection. "Ursula Corliss, I presume. Your father was a good man." The woman, who had obviously bound her breasts in order to stay hidden in the party for some reason, nodded at him. "Lord Arryn, I thank you. We must speak privately though." There was obviously an untold story here, and he led them into the Tower of the Hand and then to the solar there, where he sat down after placing Lamentation carefully to one side. "Is that Lamentation, my lord?" Bronn asked quietly as Ursula Corliss removed her cloak and helmet and then held the shield in her hands. "I saw the ruined armor and the body." "It is," Jon sighed as he thought about how he was going to send it to the north. "We recovered it earlier. And the armor, well, you should know that the runes glowed under all that dirt. Some of them anyway. It must be some magic of the first men." Bronn and his steward exchanged a long look. There was definitely something going on between them, because they were still close to each other, and there was a look in her eyes as she looked at the Lord of the Foxhold that spoke of strong emotions that were barely hidden, like a furnace that had been banked. "You found it," Bronn said to her. "You tell him." The woman's cheeks went a little pink and then she held the shield out. "Lord Arryn, the Corlishers are descended partly from the Muds. And this was in the crypt of the Foxhold. It's the shield of the Riverlands." Jon stared at the shield and then at them both in turn, before looking back at the shield. "The shield that Hoster Tully is tearing old stones apart to find. The shield of the first men. Owned by the Mud Kings." "Truly." "My lord," said Bronn hoarsely. When Ursula picked it up, the bloody thing glowed like the sun was in it. He stared at the shield and then passed a slightly trembling hand over his face. He had the oddest feeling that he was witnessing history here, something important. "Well now. He wondered what old Hoster would make of this. This and the fact that Lysa was back in the Red Keep, although he imagined that Hoster would send him a message that would sound more like something that the Blackfish would send, along the lines of kill her and be done with it. He noted that Bronn and Ursula were looking at each other again, her with a challenging, almost sultry, look and he with a look of equal challenge. He would give good odds that there would be a marriage between them both in a matter of weeks if not days. "Well, Bronn," he said at last as he leant back in his chair. "For you the word boring is just something that happens to other people, is it not?" Jon Stark. He stood there on the side of the ship, the only place he could find where he was out of the way of the Ironborn sailors, and watched until the sails of the ship carrying father dwindled on the southern horizon and then finally vanished. It was only then that he realized that he was gripping one of the ropes so tightly that his hand was hurting, and as he released his grip he pulled a face as he flexed his fingers. It was also only then that he realized that Theon was standing next to him. "We'll see him again," the former Ironborn said almost gently. "He'll come back." Jon grimaced a little. "Starks do not prosper south of the Neck," he pointed out. "We're better off in the north. And this gate that the Tyrells and the Hightowers want father's help with. I have a bad feeling about this, Theon. Forebodings even. I know. I feel them too." They both stood there for a long moment, looking at the spot on the horizon where the sails had vanished beyond the horizon, and then Ghost pushed at his lowered hand at the same time that Mist yipped. Theon looked down at the direwolves, amused. "Well, they are very worried, aren't they?" Jon smiled, and then they both turned as Asher Greyjoy bellowed a series of what seemed to Jon to be incomprehensible instructions at the men who were in the dizzying heights of the upper masts. Various bits of sails were furled whilst other larger bits were unfurled, as the crew ran around at what he knew now was not random activity. He eyed Theon's sister critically. Ever since they had met and then transferred over to Asher Greyjoy's ship, which had been summoned up from the Neck by a raven to Moat Cailin, she had been different. More alive, more vital, more in command. And more Ironborn. "She knows her business," Theon muttered at him before pulling a face. "She's better at this than I am. But of course she is. I've been at Winterfell for years whilst she's been out here sailing." The expression changed a little. And then again, turnabout. "I'm better at killing whites than she is, because I've seen them in the flesh and she hasn't. And others. And others." Silence fell between them, which was just as well, as the ship went through another burst of activity as the crew obeyed more bellowed orders from Asher. When as close to a lull as was possible fell, Jon looked at Theon again, who was scowling at the horizon. "Thinking about your father again?" He pulled a slight face. "How do you talk sense into someone who acts like a vengeful fool?" "Father," he shook his head and then sighed. "Asher will be a better leader of the Ironborn than father ever could be. She sets her sails according to how the wind blows, not the way she wants the wind to blow. And she heard the call and did not deny it." Theon's hand went to the pendant at his chest and held it for a long moment. "No," he said softly. "She does not deny it. Father does. But he can't. No one who heard it should deny it. My father is a fool." For a moment, very quietly, Jon thought of his true father, the man whose legacy was one of death, destruction and rape. Who had been the bigger fool, Rhaegar Targaryen or Balon Greyjoy? Given the latter's adherence to the iron price and the cost that entailed, were they equally guilty of being fools? And then he thrust the thought away. Best not think of that. The man that he truly called father was 1,000 times better than the man who had raped his mother. He just wished that he could have met her, or had some memory of her. "Well," Jon said after a long moment. "You'll see him soon enough." Theon nodded somberly. Then he looked over at the stern, where a figure was hunched over the side, retching weakly. "I wonder how long it'll be before your Ygritte finds her sea legs." Jon considered this. He'd gotten used to the sensation of being at sea surprisingly well so far, and the direwolves had both taken it in their stride. Ygritte had not. It was understandable. The wilderling had been stunned at the sight of the sea, and then, as the ship had started to pitch and yaw, had gone pale and then almost green. She'd been at the stern for a while now, watched over by an amused Asher Greyjoy who would occasionally pass her a waterskin. She'd also told him, very firmly, to fuck off and leave her to die. "She's not my Ygritte," he protested. She's no one's but her own. She's yours, Theon laughed. Anyone else touches her, they'll get a knife in the eye. If I offer to go and help her now, I'll get a knife in the bloody eye, John japed weakly. She's seasick. She'll get used to it. We'll be at Harlaw in a few days anyway. Theon looked at where the sun was and then at the pennant at the mainmast, before nodding. Winds coming from the northwest. Rounding Cape Crooken was the hard bit. We'll be there in few days indeed, and meet mine uncle. Well, two of them. Roderick and Victorian. What's the reader like? John asked curiously. Obviously he reads. Theon paused. I remember him when I left Pike, after father's gamble failed. He's kind. Thoughtful. Thinks a lot. If only someone who thought a lot had been in charge of the Iron Islands years ago, John thought, and from the flicker of Theon's eyes, he could tell that he thought the same thing. After a long moment he looked back at Ygritte. He needed to do something about her. But what? Wed her and bed her was probably the advice that Theon would give him. Asher's view would probably be to just take her to bed, have his way with her, or would that be really her having her way with him? And then wed her. He had to admit that he had no idea what course to chart. She was a wilderling, yes, but clever and beautiful and deadly, and he didn't know what to do with her, other than be confused. So he took his life in his hands, nodded at Theon and then walked over to help her with her seasickness. He could always dodge the knife, as she was wobblier than a newborn fawn right now. Tyrion. The little raven scroll lay there on the table in front of him and he had no idea what he should be feeling about it. Relief. Vague mourning. A certain measure of satisfaction. It represented failure, the complete and utter failure of a Lannister, albeit a Lannister who had damned many future generations of the family to doubt, ridicule and vague suspicion, if, that is, they were lucky. Sensing movement to one side he looked over and saw Robb Stark watching him worriedly. I suppose, he said as wryly as he could manage, that I should be thankful that this has come. Robb sighed. The bruise on his forehead had not yet ripened to full maturity, but it still looked quite painful. Also at the table were Daisy and Lady Stark, both also staring at the small piece of paper. Tyrion, the heir to Winterfell, said quietly, "Do you want me to handle this?" For a moment he wanted to cravenly mutter yes, but after a moment he shook his head. "No, I appreciate the offer, Robb. But my sister should hear the news of the location of her place of exile from me. I am the senior Lannister here." He looked at Lady Stark. "How has her behavior been of late?" Cat Stark pulled a slight face. "She still tries to give orders. There are times when she claims to be queen, even now. At least she's stopped throwing the food at the servants when they won't obey her." He rolled his eyes a little at that. "Ah, Cersei. Robb, the guards who escort her there, or at least to White Harbor, must be strong-minded and preferably married. She will try to suborn them." The words "like she suborned her own twin brother" hung unsaid in the air. Robb Stark nodded. "I'll talk to Sir Roderick about that. He'll pick out the best men for the task." And then there was a knock at the door, which opened to reveal Lewin, who was clutching a large map in one hand. "I have it," the old Maester said with a certain measure of grave satisfaction, before rolling the map out. It was a map of the Vale and was in remarkable detail. Lewin peered at it carefully and then jabbed at a point on it with a long and bony finger. "There, my lords, my ladies." They all squinted at it. Ah. Yes, that was indeed remote. And with a very apt name. Lost Sister. It was not one of the three sisters, it was further east than that, quite a bit further east. It was also somewhat small. "I've never heard of it," he muttered. "Not an island to feature in much history." "It does not feature in much history at all," Lord Tyrion the old Maester said quietly. "It was claimed by the Vale back in the time of the First Men, has a small holdfast on it, one that has been held by a number of small lords, none of whom really wanted it after realizing how small it is. It is, from what I have read, rather rocky, has a very small amount of arable land, sees a large amount of rain, so it does not lack for water, and does not have a decent anchorage. It is largely dependent on outside supplies." Perfect, Tyrion quipped with a humor that he did not entirely feel. On the one hand, this was to be the miserable place of exile for a Lannister. On the other hand, that Lannister was Cersei who deserved far less. I must tell my sister then. Daisy stood as well, but he waved her back. My love, I do not think that she would react well to this. I would have you safe and sound. She is, not of sound mind. Then I will at least walk with you to the room and wait outside. His wife said the words firmly and in such a way that he knew that there was no arguing with her. So he smiled slightly and nodded, before bowing slightly to the others and walking off with his wife. It was a quiet walk and he rejoiced at her silent support next to him. Father should have been the one doing this, but father was on his way to the wall with the king. Father would not have enjoyed this moment either, but father would also have had the stony and utterly unemotional face that he lacked. When they finally reached the room where his sister was held, he looked at his wife, who bent down and kissed him before sitting down on a bench to one side and looked at him. Good luck. He took a deep breath and then nodded at her and then nodded at the guard who was at the door, who opened it. He girded his loins and walked in. Cersei was slumped on the bed as he entered. As the door closed behind him, he looked at her. She was clad in a dress that was more suited for the north than the south and therefore, oh the horror, unfashionable. Her hair was less than perfectly arranged, she had black lines under her eyes and she was visibly thinner than she had been before. And then she noticed him. Suddenly she was on her feet and had flattened herself against the opposite wall from him. She looked visibly terrified of him and he frowned. He opened his mouth to speak, but she beat him to it. No. You're here to kill me. Genuinely surprised by this, he closed his mouth, before eyeing his sister carefully. She looked more than a bit afraid and possibly even deranged. I'm not here to kill you, he said as soothingly as he could before walking to the nearest chair and sitting on it. I'm here to tell you when father was not able to. A place has been chosen for your exile. It's an island off the coast of the Vale. Lord Orin has sent his permission for you to live out the rest of your days there. There was a pause as Cersei just stared at him. She seemed to be having trouble with several things. I'm being sent away from this place. Yes. Into exile. Yes. Father arranged this. He resisted the need to roll his eyes. Yes. She pulled a face of utter disbelief. Then she looked up. Where's father? God's not this again. Heading for the wall with King Robert. Her face changed in an instant to one of almost maniacal glee. He's going to get Jaime and Joffrey. He's going to get them and burn the north from the wall to the neck. Burn them all. Burn Winterfell. He's going to unleash the mountain on them all. And on that bitch, Catelyn Stark. Oh, he'll take his time over her. The hairs on the back of his neck rose at her tone of crooning maliciousness and the look in her eyes. He glanced down quickly at the warnings, but they were normal. This was not possession, this was the real Cersei, the thing that hid behind the polite if strained smile and the hooded eyes. Right. Time to shut her up. No, he snapped. Father's going to see the wall and scout out where this war that's coming against the others and their whites is to be fought. And the mountain will never do anything to anyone ever again. He's dead. She stared at him as if he was the mad one of the two. The mountain is not dead, she hissed. The mountain cannot be dead. Don't be a fool. He's dead, he replied in a flat, hard voice. I watched his body burn myself, his severed head on the pyre as well. He tried and failed to kill Robb Stark, who fought him off in time for the Hound to come to his aid and kill him. The mountain is dead. And, whilst I know that you will not believe this, he was possessed. His eyes were jet black. Some Valyrian spell was used on him. He slapped a hand at the warnings. That's why I have these on me. They glowed and shook when next to the mountain's body. His oldest sibling said nothing at this news, but just stared at him as he was truly raving mad. Black eyes, she said eventually. People do not have black eyes. You're lying. No, he said tiredly. I'm not. Father is not going to kill your perceived enemies. We're fighting a war that you would never understand. Anyway, you'll be leaving here within a few days. Down to White Harbor and then by sea to the island in question. It's called Lost Sister. Appropriate name, is it not? Cersei flinched violently as if he had struck her, her hands coming up to her face. No, she muttered eventually. No. He watched her sadly and then got down off the chair and walked quietly to the door. Just before he got to it he heard her go from muttering no to a sobbing laugh. "I don't understand." "Understand what?" He asked the question tiredly. He needed to get out of this horrible room and away from his mad sister, but he still turned back to look at her. She had a peculiar look on her face, as if she was struggling to make sense of something. If I'm going to be in exile, then how will you kill me?" He threw his hands in the air at that. "What in the name of all the gods, the old and the new, are you talking about? Why do you have this delusion that I'm going to kill you?" She looked at him. "The prophecy said so," she said in words of utter finality. "Maggie the Frog said so." Once again the hairs on the back of his neck rose at the tone of her words. Maggie the Frog. She was a witch. In Lannisport. She tasted our blood. I was 10 and I wanted her to read my future. He eyed her carefully and then made sure that the door was at his back. She sounded deranged again. Then he paused. "Our. Who were you with?" "Jane Farman, but she ran away, and." "Malaya. Malaya Heatherspoon." The name rang a faint bell in his mind, but then Cersei was off again. "We went to see her. She could predict the future. I wanted to know when I would marry Rhaegar, but she said that would marry the king instead. And then I asked, will the king and I have children? And she said, oh, 6 and 10 for him, and 3 for you. Gold shall be their crowns and gold their shrouds, she said. And when your tears have drowned you, the Valonqua shall wrap his hands about your pale white throat and choke the life from you." She stared at him again, her tear-stained face with wide mad eyes. "I know, Valerian. You are the Valonqua. You're going to kill me." He stared at her, his eyes almost as wide as hers. "God's damn night. Valonqua. Yes. You're him. You're going to kill me." He steeled himself to be as still as possible. "So you heard and believed the words of a so-called witch, read a vast amount into a few words, failed to realize that she likely saw your very golden hair and deduced that any children you had would also be golden-haired, and then decided that I was a threat to your life." He ran his hands over his face for a long moment, and then when he looked back at her he could see that she was confused. Eventually he mustered every scrap of self-control that he possessed. Gods, he needed a cup of wine after this and then some time in a locked bedroom with his lovely wife, and forced himself to say, in a low and measured tone, "Sister, I know that you blame me for the death of Mother, even though I had nothing to do with it. She had a difficult birth, like so many others. As for this Valonqua nonsense, I doubt it means what you think. For one thing, you are the firstborn. Jaime might have been this Valonqua, not I. The word is also a name for an ailment of the chest in Myr, and is, I believe, also the name of a street pastry in Bravos. This is, if you even remember the name correctly, because Valonqua is the name of a type of fish snack in Volantis." Once again she was gaping at him. He tried again. What did this so-called witch tell Malaya Heatherspoon? That she would die soon. And she hinted that I would be the one to kill her. She said that last sentence as her eyes almost flitted about the room. He went still. He remembered now. There had been talk of the Heatherspoon search for their missing daughter. "I see," he said in as calm and level a voice as he could muster. "So I am presuming that you killed her and somehow hid the body in such a way that she would not be found. Because, presumably, she heard the prophecy that you thought should be a secret." Cersei gazed at him with what looked like utter terror. "You sound just like Father." "That's Father's voice. Give it back to him." "You can't use it, you're just a disgusting little murdering dwarf." "Right. Enough. This dwarf is now the heir to Casterly Rock and fervently prays to every god that I never see you again in my life. You will be leaving for Lost Sister in a few days. You will be allowed to see Myrcella and Tommen before she leaves for Casterly Rock and he leaves for the Citadel. Part of me hopes that the others and their whites get you, but to do so would mean that the North would have to fall, so perhaps not. Goodbye, Cersei. You have poisoned everything you have touched and nothing you have attempted has ever worked. You are a failure as a Lannister, the lowliest Lannister." And with that he left the room, leaving her frozen with what seemed to be a combination of terror, fury and disbelief. As he closed the door he heard her start screaming insults at him, which the door muffled. Daisy had stood up and was waiting for him as he passed the guards, who were rolling their eyes and muttering at his sister's piss-poor use of insults as one called it. "I was going to ask how it went, but your face says it all," his wife sighed. "It was bad, wasn't it?" "Very bad. I'll tell you later. Let's go back to our rooms. I need some wine and then we are going to practice making little Sherestone /Lannisters who won't be raving mad." She blushed a little as she took his proffered hand but then grinned at him and raised her eyebrows in such a way as to signal her enthusiastic agreement. Something good would come from this. Chapter 47, Chapter 46. Chapter text. Sorry about the delay on this. New job has been eating my brain, plus the Six Nations has restarted, and as a Wales fan things have been rather surprisingly amazing. My wife had her COVID jab on Wednesday and I am due to get mine next week. Stay safe, people. This will pass in time and we will emerge on the other side of what has been the storm of our lifetimes. Jamie. No one knew what to do with him. The irony was a bitter one, he mused as he stood on top of the wall and stared north with almost unseeing eyes. Oh, they knew what probably should be done with him, but no firm decision had yet been made about him. The Night's Watch was divided into 3 orders: builders, stewards and rangers. The thought of him as a builder, maintaining the wall with a hammer in his hand, bashing in nails, or whatever they did, was ludicrous. Then there were the stewards. They were the ones who maintained the wall and the Night's Watch. They cooked what they grew or hunted, sewed things to other things, marked out the horses and generally just took care of things. He was no cook and he could not sew. That just left being a ranger, a fighting man on the wall and beyond it. He had been born to wield a sword and he was far better than anyone else on the wall, even with the men who were flocking to the wall to answer the call. The call. He blinked and looked north again. It was cold here on the top of the wall and he had to admit that he was beginning to understand that the first men would not have built it, nor the men who followed them maintained it, without fearing something to the north very much. And based on the attitude of the men and women around him on the wall, they feared that something still. It reminded him of the last days before the sack of King's Landing during the rebellion. Everyone had known that the rebels were coming and that a fight would happen, they just didn't know exactly when. He had the same feeling. A shiver rippled through him as he looked at the forest beyond the wall. There was still a trickle of wildlings filtering through it towards the gate below, and from all accounts they were from the furthest north of the lands beyond the wall. They had had the most experience of fighting the others. The others. He had scorned such tales. Legends. Stories. Mutterings of snooks and grumpkins. But based on what Tyrion had said, and others, they were real. The arriving wildlings had certainly shown so much relief on getting through the wall. There had been one incident that he remembered that morning. A tall man had limped through the gate, supporting himself on a crutch as one leg had obviously been broken and then reset. He had caught Jamie's eye because he had been thin and looked about the yard of Castle Black with such desperation. And then there had been a shocked cry from a tall woman that he had seen working with others, a woman who had a baby in a sling around her neck and a small boy in constant attendance. She had run at once to the man with the crutch, sobbing hysterically, the boy following her, and based on their embrace he knew that she had thought that he was dead. It had made him think of Cersei for a long moment. And then he dismissed that thought with a shake of the head. Enough. Enough. She was lost to him. A horn blew, the sound high and wailing, ahead of him, and he peered carefully over the wall. A small knot of horsemen had appeared from the trees to the north, and one of his new brothers with one of the growing number of Mirish spyglasses looked down. "It's the first ranger," he grunted, before looking at Jamie. "Go on, lad, get down and tell them." It smarted more than a bit to be called lad, but he obeyed orders. He had to. The mechanism for getting down, the lift or whatever the name for it was, took him down at a steady rate, and as he descended he bellowed out that the first ranger was approaching, something that got the attention of even that sour-faced human persimmon Sir Alisa Bloody Thorn. The man who rode through the gate at the head of the group of horsemen was undoubtedly a Stark, based on his appearance. The nose was a dead giveaway, as was that look of thundering rectitude. He looked tired and strained, as did the others in his party, at least one of whom looked like a Thun. Stark dismounted, clasped hands with Thorn and then the old maester, who had hurried up as fast as he could. Stark was talking and gesturing at the gate, but he had little idea what they were talking about. Thorn and the Maester eventually nodded thoughtfully, and then Thorn looked straight at him and jerked his thumb at him whilst muttering something to Stark. A grey-eyed look was sent his way, and then Stark walked back to his dismounted party, shook hands, or in some cases forearms, all around, and then walked his horse to the stables before vanishing off somewhere. It wasn't until later, after Jaime had returned to his solitary room and stared at the opposite wall for a bit, that he was summoned to the chamber of the first Ranger. Benjen Stark's hair was damp and he looked freshly scrubbed, but his eyes were far too like those of Ned Stark as he assessed him and then waved him into the chair in front of his desk. "Sir Jaime." The words were reasonably courteous and he wondered how to respond. Stark might be a bit too blunt, so he went with, "First Ranger." Stark looked at him shrewdly. "Given who you are, the final determination of what to do with you is up to the Lord Commander, not me, but I will be one of those who make recommendations. And I have to say that there is every chance that you will be assigned to the Rangers. Unless you wish otherwise, that will be the best use of your skills." He nodded, dully. "Good." Stark looked at him with those same damn eyes as his brother, no, both his brothers, and then sniffed slightly. "Sir Alisa says that you have some skill with the sword." The words came out without him even hesitating. "Well, I was a member of the Kingsguard." Stark narrowed his eyes at this and then leant back in his chair a little. "And that means nothing here," he said cuttingly. "For 3 reasons. First, we all know why you were appointed to that post the first time. The Mad King appointed you there to spite your father. Second, after your sister became queen she insisted on you staying close to her. And third, you are skilled at killing live men. Not at fighting the others and their undead minions. Your brother knows much about that. You do not." He could feel the blood flushing into his face as those words struck home. But as he opened his mouth to angrily refute much of that, he could not actually say it. There were too many truths in those words. After a moment Stark seemed to take pity on him. "You are not the only fighting man who has joined and then realized that he needs retraining. You and they are used to fighting the living, not the dead, and most certainly not the others. If you fought a white, then you would soon realize that wounds that would kill a man would not even slow down a white. You need to hamstring them, decapitate, dismember, cut through bones. Even the finest of swords wielded by the most skillful of men can have a problem with that. And as for fighting others, well, your brother has Rocktooth and the warnings and you do not, nor do you have a sword made from Valyrian steel. If you fight another with a sword made from ordinary steel, then your sword will shatter into 1,000 fragments when it meets their ice's words." For a moment he was back in that courtyard in Winterfell, watching as Stormbreaker turned his swords into nothing but fragments as it found him wanting. And then he was back in the room with Stark. "So how do you kill these others then?" Stark just looked at him, seeming to be amused by the way that Jaime had pronounced the word, before looking to one side and sliding a dagger over. The pommel was metal wrapped in leather, but the blade was stone. "Dragonglass," the first Ranger said in a voice like iron. "Not much use when it comes to fighting men, but that will save your life if you meet another and if you can drive it into their flesh." "Can you use a bow?" Faintly bewildered he shook his head. "A shame," Stark sighed. "You might look into it. A dragonglass tipped arrow can kill a white, so it should also be able to kill another." He frowned a little for a moment. "Anyway, a final determination as to your status in the Night's Watch will rest with the Lord Commander. That said, I have little doubt that you will be a Ranger. I must also say that there is no chance that you will ever be a wandering crow, going south to recruit for us." Of course not. Not that he expected it. Too many might think that he would use such a role to break his oath and run away. "So what must I do now?" "Wait. Wait and train." A faint smile crossed Stark's face. "The Lord Commander travels fast and will be with us in a day or so." And with that he was dismissed, walking back out into the chilly courtyard outside where so many of his new brothers were training. As he looked about he realized that many of them, including Thorn, had daggers at their hips at all times, daggers with blades made from stone. They believed in those blades, even though they looked crude and unbalanced. He had always had a dagger in his boot, or at his waist, but the thought of using something so primitive was strange to him. He almost wanted to laugh, but he could not. He slept badly that night. Too many unsettled thoughts, too much uneasiness, and then, when he did fall asleep, too many bad dreams. The day that the Starks had died so horribly in the throne room of the Red Keep had featured in his dreams. So had the day that Robert Baratheon had beaten him in that courtyard. No. Not beaten him, humiliated him. Stormbreaker had judged him and found him utterly wanting. So, when it came time to break his fast, he found himself nudging the porridge around his wooden bowl with his spoon listlessly. As porridge went, it wasn't bad. There was even a bit of jam in with it. But he had no appetite, unlike the others around him. One of them, a man with a long nose and a dolorous aspect, peered at him from one side. "You should eat that," he said. "Never turn down good food. Time might come when you don't have any." What a cheerful fellow he was. He sighed and spooned some into his mouth. He almost commented that it wasn't the food that he was used to, but then he hadn't had any of that since the day that he and Cersei had been discovered. "You have a point," he said instead as he looked at the man and searched his mind for a name. "Tolet, isn't it?" Edison Tolet." The man finished his own porridge with every sign of satisfaction. Catching sight of Jaime's look of askance, he sighed. "When you've been stuck ranging north of the wall, with little food and nothing to hunt, you realize the value of a bit of porridge. Could have done with some at the Overlook." He frowned a little. "The Overlook? Where's that?" "By the Fist of the First Men," Tolet said, before his face stilled a little. "First time I ever saw them." This was confusing. Saw who? Tolet seemed to come back from wherever he had briefly gone to. "Others. I saw the others for the first time there." Jaime eyed him for a moment. "The first time?" Tolet nodded. "Second time was by Craster's Keep." He fell silent, obviously wrestling with something. It was a man to one side who elbowed Tolet gently in the ribs. "Give over." "Hoa, Lannister, yes, we all know who you are. This is Other Bayned, formerly Dolorous Ed, the first Black Brother in 1,000 years or more to kill another." He stared at the man. "You killed another?" "I did," Tolet replied faintly. "I'll never forget that moment. It shattered like glass." Unable to really grasp any of that, he nodded, finished his porridge and then returned to his room to fully dress before exiting into the courtyard. Someone had set up straw dummies there that had arms and legs and heads that could be detached with a strong swipe at the head, and he spent some time there, practicing his swings. It took precision, and after a while he had built up such a sweat that he removed his cloak and jerkin. Hearing a horn blown to the south, he looked away from the target he had been hitting. The sun was high in the sky and a group of builders and stewards were leaving in wagons for the night fort, to work on the place. As they left, a group of horsemen entered and he groaned quietly. The man leading them was the old bear himself, the Lord Commander, Gia Mormont. And trailing at the rear was a golden-haired young man who was drooping in the saddle and who looked extremely uncomfortable. "Ah. Joffrey." As the horseman dismounted, Jaime frowned a little. Everyone walking downwind of his nephew knew it was time to admit certain things. His son was pulling a face. Thorne strode up to the Lord Commander, followed by Stark and then more slowly by Maester Aemon. They all clasped forearms, and then Mormont jerked a thumb at the miserable form of Joffrey. "This is Joffrey Hill. Someone get him to the bloody bathhouse, please. He needs to be scrubbed down and his clothes washed." He shut himself at the sight of his first giant in the gift a few hours ago. He sighed. Life at the wall was not going to be easy, was it? Kevan. They had paused for the night. The evening was still gathering come as the sun slipped down to the horizon and the men scurried around them as they made camp near an old ruined holdfast. It was like being on campaign again. But he was troubled. He could not help it. Tywin was not quite himself. He was accustomed to his brother being taciturn, but Tywin was curt, troubled in his language and also his demeanor for those like him who knew what to look for. He sighed. And then looked around. After a moment he realized that Geryon was walking towards him. His brother smiled slightly and then looked around cautiously before sitting down with a sigh. "Are you as?" Geryon seemed to search for the right word before continuing in that same low voice, "troubled as I am about Tywin." He paused, looked about at the men as they finished erecting the larger tents and then started pulling on the ropes that allowed the smaller ones to start to rise, before raising both eyebrows and nodding shortly. "I am." He's as quiet as I've ever known him to be. There is much on his mind. And I cannot say that I blame him. Our house is not where it was just months ago. There is a lot to do to recover our reputation. Jerian rubbed his chin for a moment and then pulled a slight face. I think that Tywine is mulling over all the things that he has misjudged over the years. Even gotten wrong. He looked about again, as careful as he was able to and still make look natural. This was dangerous ground. Wrong in what way? Maria was the first. Jerian caught the look on his face and snorted. Oh come now brother, you know as well as I do that he was right to confront the Rains and the Tarbecks, but wrong to wipe them all out. He should have left a few of them alive as an example. And Maria itself is lost to us. The gold and silver mines are flooded and you and I, as Lannisters who know everything about mining, both know that once a tunnel is flooded then it is all but lost. The pit props of Maria have long since rotted in that water and the tunnels have collapsed. From that point alone it was a mistake, ignoring the fact that they were our cousins and were wiped out. He winced, sighed, ran a hand over his face and then slowly nodded. Jerian had the right of it. And the second. Jerian took a deep breath. His children. He was wrong to see so little in Tyrion and so much in Cersei and Jaime. From an early age I knew that Tyrion had a brilliant mind, that he was a true Lannister. But as for the other two, I always felt that there was something wrong with Cersei, something twisted, whilst as for Jaime he was almost father come again. Too much smile and not enough substance. Granted, he killed Aes for the right reasons, but why did he not tell anyone those reasons? He shook his head. Tyrion will be the true heir to Tywine that Jaime could never be. I think that Tywine knows that now. The problem is that if he knows all of that, what else could he have been wrong about? And that, I think, is what gnaws at the mind of our brother. He sat there for a long moment as he thought about everything that the man he had thought to be the most frivolous of his brothers had said, and then he nodded somberly. Jerian, how did you become so wise? His brother ran a finger over his eye patch. This gave me a new perspective on life. This and being a father to a group of very rambunctious children. I hope that you meet them all one day. You have nephews and nieces that you've never met, as well as a good sister. A smile stole over his face. Jerian as a harassed father was an amusing thought. He thought of his own children and looked over to where Lancel was talking to Illyrian. By the look on the latter's face, his oldest son was being his usual self. That boy needed fostering somewhere that would teach him some of the harder truths in life. Jerian had followed his gaze. Your son needs a little seasoning. He's a good lad, but he's a touch full of himself. He nodded slowly. Jerian was right. Lancel could be too set in his ways, too sure of himself, too arrogant. True, recent events had knocked some of that arrogance more than a bit, but he still worried about the boy. That said, they were all going to the wall to view where they would fight in the war that lay ahead of them. If that didn't knock some sense into him, nothing would. Perhaps he should foster him in the north as well. He'd heard that Mage Mormont was a truly unique woman. Your Illyrian is a credit to you, Jerian. His brother smiled almost wistfully. There's a lot of his mother in him. She's taught him a lot of sense. He has my brains though. Not sure if that's a good thing. Amused, he chuckled for a moment. And then a man dressed in Baratheon colors ran up to him and bowed hurriedly. Good sirs, His Grace the King requests your presence, and the presence of Lord Lannister, at once. He eyed the panting man and frowned a little. What's amiss? All I know, Sir Kevan, is that there was a message from Winterfell. His Grace says to please come at once. Sir Jerian most especially. Jerian and he exchanged troubled gazes and then nodded and stood, Jerian calling to Lancel to summon Tywine to the king at once. His son looked confused but obeyed the command at once, and once a stony-faced Tywine had emerged from his large tent, the three Lannister brothers strode over to the even larger tent that the king slept in. Inside they found the king and Sir Barristan Selmy staring at a number of raven messages on the table in front of them, with Lords Tarly and Westerling sitting on camp chairs to one side with odd looks on their faces. Your Grace, Tywine said as the trio bowed, you summoned us. I said the king with a frown, before handing the messages over to Tywine. Word from Winterfell, the mountain is dead. There was a pause as they absorbed that information. And then Kevan said what surely they were all thinking, what? How? He attacked Robb Stark and that wilding girl, the king replied as he sank into a camp chair. And he was not himself. He went mad. I thought he had guards watching him. Geryon asked before a pale Tywine handed over the messages. He killed the guards with his bare hands, Tywine muttered. Young Stark was lucky that Clegane was not armed. He barely fought him off before the Hound arrived. From what Tyrion writes, it was a close thing. He peered over Geryon's shoulder as they both read the tale of madness that lay in the messages. They were indeed in Tyrion's handwriting, close set and tiny as he had obviously tried to get as much information as possible on the small scroll. 3 had been needed for the full tale. And then there were the parts that made his eyes bulge. When he looked up he could see that the Green Man had arrived, along with the Blackfish and Brian of Tarth, both of whom still confused him due to their oddly close relationship. He looked at the king. Clegane had black eyes. Eyes that were totally black. And Tyrion writes of a Valyrian spell of possession. How can this be? The king raised his own eyebrows and then shook his head. I don't know, Sir Kevan. It's baffling to me. However, whilst my first thought was to associate Valyrian with Targaryen, my second thought was to realize that it can't be the girl. If the Targaryens had access to such magics, then I, or Jon Arryn or Ned Stark would have seen a black-eyed assassin in the rebellion. We did not. This was a good point, shrewd enough that he looked at the king for a moment and then nodded. Yes, the man had truly changed. He would never be a great thinker, but when his mind was unclouded by wine and food and whores he could see clearly enough. Damn Cersei yet again. Lord Lannister, the king said. You were close to the Mad King before he went truly mad. Would I be right in my thinking that he never had access to such magic? There was a pause as the Lord of the Westerlands narrowed his eyes in thought before nodding. I think that you are right, Your Grace. Aerys Targaryen often complained about how much his family had lost in the long years since the fall of Valyria. And it must also be remembered that the Targaryens were not numbered amongst the most powerful of the Dragon Lords. I cannot recall of any similar incident in all my years at court or elsewhere. And if Aerys had been able to cast such magic, he would have. He would have used it to escape from Duskendale at the very least, and he would have used it against you, Your Grace. The fact that no one did is significant. Such magic was unknown to King Aegon, Your Grace, the Green Man said in a voice laden suddenly with the years. He would never have used it. And, like the Mad King, he complained about what his family had lost. But he never had access to it. The king nodded somberly, before looking at Geryon. Sir Geryon, you, out of all of us, have had the most experience of Valyrian dark magics. What say you? There was a pause as his brother seemed to collect himself. Your Grace, I have often thought of the Mad Dragon Lord who held my men and I prisoners and who did such horrible things to some of us. Given what he did to meld human and animal together, he must have been a fleshsmith at the very least and a powerful sorcerer to keep death at bay for both himself and the man who I believe to have been King Tommen. And, the spell he cast on that last day, it was a spell to suborn a bloody dragon. That sounds like this. I don't know if that dragon that was being driven by the spell to the crag had black eyes, but I would not bet money against it. Another, longer, pause followed, a silence made by pale people contemplating horrors that they had heard about but did not want to imagine. It was broken by the king. You almost made it to Valyria. Could others have done so? Did you see other crags with ruins that might have been intact, which might have contained the knowledge of old Valyria? Geryon stilled for a long moment. Perhaps, Your Grace. When I glimpsed the broken towers of Valyria, with the fires beyond, there might been a few closer ruins. But I do not know for sure. What I do know though is that Valyria is a giant tomb that contains great riches. And that there are always those who want to loot such tombs. I went there for Brightraw. Others go there for other things. Graver robbers. Most die, and I regret that retrieving Brightraw cost me so many of my crew. But if I could get so far into the smoking sea by being cautious and careful, what is to say that someone else could do so as well? And discover other things. Other knowledge. He shook his head. I just hope that they do not pay the same eventual price as Aeya Targaryen. Valyria is a place that none should ever approach. I was a fool to go there. He eyed his brother and then nodded. The king did too. So he rumbled eventually, we must be mindful of this. My lords, care to your men. Have your lieutenants go about them, where you can. According to the messages from Winterfell, the mountain complained of dark thoughts and dark dreams before he was possessed. Ask if any of your men feel the same. The assembled men nodded and muttered agreement, before Sir Barristan Selmy cleared his throat. Your Grace, Lord Tyrion writes that the warnings glowed red near the body of Gregor Clegane before it was burnt. The warning are the work of the first men. So is Stormbreaker. It might be that it, too, glows in the presence of such foul magics. A very good point, Sir Barristan the King agreed. Very well, I shall ride up and down the column tomorrow as we ride north. If any man is showing signs of possession, then hopefully the sword will show it. My lords, we have a foe that is using fell magics against us. Word has been sent out to warn every Stark. Be mindful. They stood at this dismissal, bowed and left. And by the look of intent thought on the face of Tywin Lannister, he knew that he was thinking hard about just who that unknown foe might be. Robb. The most peaceful place that he knew of in Winterfell was the Godswood. He sat there, looking at the carved face on the white trunk tree, and wondered, yet again, who might have carved it. Had it been a first man, perhaps one of his ancestors? Or one of the children of the forest? That last possibility was one that made him shiver a little. There was a folk tale that one of his ancestors had married one of the little folk, or been closely involved with one. If only his ancestors had left better records. Perhaps they had, but they just hadn't found them yet, and he stirred uneasily at that. The Green Man had told him to search for hidden things here in Winterfell, and so far he had not. There had been too much to do, too much to organize, too many distractions, like the mountain trying to kill him, and above all Val. He clenched his fists and then released them and rubbed his hands over his face. There were times when his memories of that other time, of that horrible world when father had been murdered and Bran was crippled, and when his victories on the field of battle had turned to nothing because he had been a fool, made him almost cringe. You seem to be anguished, Robb. He looked up at that and then sighed a little as he saw Mother standing there to one side. She looked sympathetic, as if she could guess what was on his mind. I've been thinking a lot, he said eventually. About matters. His mother nodded, and then she glided into the glade and sat down next to him. Oddly enough, so have I. About what? Mother looked about carefully, obviously to make sure that no one was near them. That other time. In your memories. So many mistakes, not just by you but by me as well. That has caused me much pause for reflection. There were so many things that I did that must have seemed to be sensible at the time but which were not. She paused, her face working as she tried to articulate something that she was having a hard time admitting. Robb waited for a long moment, until Mother finally seemed to come to a decision. I was wrong about many things. So many things. I was wrong to dislike Jon for so long. I did not know the truth about his mother, but I should not have thought what I did about him, and I regret that now. I was prejudiced. I did not know your father as well at first as I do now, but as I grew to love him, well, that's water under the bridge. So I have decided that I will think more and react less in the future. There was a pause as he thought about this, and then he nodded. Thank you, Mother. You said I looked anguished. You do. She looked at him shrewdly. You are thinking about Val and how the heart wants what the head denies. He laughed softly for a moment before admitting, yes. Mother eyed him carefully. I have a possible solution, but 'tis only a theory. Confused, he looked at her. A theory? Have you ever asked Val about her parentage? He blinked. I can't say that I have. Why? I have, and you should. She said that her mother's name was Rowan and that she came from a great hearth just south of the wall. She and her sister are well spoken, they are well educated, and they are unlike any other wilderling that anyone has met. They sound almost like northern nobility. Now, what great hearth exists just south of the wall, Robb? He looked at his mother, genuinely stunned. The last hearth. And then something dawned on him. Wait, Rowan. Rowan Umber. The daughter of Mors Crowfoot Umber, the great Jon's uncle. Perhaps, Mother said intently. Perhaps. This Rowan is on her way to Winterfell. I have had a word with a few people. And Ned Umber is coming as well, escorted by his great-uncle, because I think that the Umbers think that young Ned is a match for Arya. The thought of anyone being a match for the force of nature that was Arya made him pause for thought and then pull a slight face. The poor lad seemed too weak a thing to say. He made do with, well, that should be interesting. Then he paused. When will the Umbers arrive? And Rowan? This Rowan should be here in a few days. The same with the Umbers. And then Mother just looked at him. Don't get your hopes up too much. It's just a theory. And if it's wrong, then there are times when even the heart must listen to the head. He muttered. But if it's right, then Val is half Umber. And that might be the advantage that the heart needs. Mother tilted her head at that, and then she kissed him on the cheek and departed, leaving him alone in the godswood, staring at the heart tree again. He never knew afterwards how long he sat there, staring at the face carved on the tree, but all of a sudden the moment was broken by an abrupt feeling that someone was watching him, some undefinable feeling of, not unease, but certainty that someone was out there. Something creaked in one of the branches above him, and as he looked up just for a moment he thought he could see something with green eyes watching him through a branch or three before that thing vanished upwards. When he left the godswood he had the oddest feeling of rightness. As if something was suddenly very right with the world. And that he needed to start to search Winterfell. Starting with the crypts. Jon Arryn. He sat at his desk and then ran a hand over his face before looking at the Grand Maester with a certain amount of weary confusion. So, my wife has recovered from the fever that she had after her trip from the foxhold, but you are still not sure if I should confront her. Pycelle sat there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped in what looked like genuine concern. Lord Arryn, your wife or former wife, after all she has done, was grievously wounded and has barely recovered from that wound. There was also a certain amount of mental disarrangement, if I might be permitted to describe it as that. Her actions surrounding your son and getting him addicted to his medicine speaks of, well, it says that she was not well, mentally speaking, at the very least. Sending your son to Winterfell and then executing the traitor Baelish seems to have accelerated that decline, which led to her vicious attack on you. Your wife veers between being stable and being unstable. I cannot predict how she will therefore react when she lays eyes on you. My lord, she might attack you again. He sat there for a long moment. Grand Maester, that is a risk that I must be willing to take. He paused again, thinking of the times that he and Lysa had gone through. And then, she tried to kill me after I killed the man that she had betrayed me with. Baelish was a traitor, he committed crimes that I still cannot understand. And yet she was obsessed with him. And tried to kill me as a result. But, as she is the mother of my son and heir, I must question her. Pycelle absorbed this with a worried frown and then closed his eyes and nodded slowly. I understand, my lord. In which case I suggest that you go in with a trusted man, just in case. And with that he stood, bowed, and shuffled out. He sat there for a while, thinking about his past wives. Was he cursed? Jane had died birthing a stillborn daughter. Rowena had died of a chill without giving him any children. Lysa had had many miscarriages before delivering him a son whom she had cosseted, kept close to her and poisoned to make sure that he depended on her. Enough. Enough. He stood up. Quill. His faithful servant stepped forwards. My lord. It's time to see my wife. He gripped the dagger at his hip and then smiled a mirthless smile. Be mindful of her instability. Aye, my lord. They pattered down the steps of the Tower of the Hand and then made their way across the courtyard to the Red Keep. The palace was quieter than it was normally due to the absence of the king and the actual Hand, making it rather more pleasant to be around. That said, as he climbed several flights of stairs and approached the room in which Lysa was being kept, a ball of vague dread formed in his stomach. He was not looking forward to this. As the door opened he could see that Lysa was sitting in a chair by the fire, looking at it with a hopeless, dead-eyed stare. He stepped into the room, Quill behind him, and as the door closed Lysa finally turned to see who had entered the room. The moment she laid eyes on him she froze with shock, her eyes widening almost comically. He eyed her wearily, before walking over to the nearest chair and sitting down, conscious that Quill was glaring at Lysa the entire time. Only then did he look at her. Lysa. She looked at him with eyes that were filled with horror, before her mouth opened and then shut several times as if she had no idea what to say to him. The best response was a sardonic look and then a slight smile. Yes, you failed to kill me. He leant back, feeling weary of this already. I want to know why. Confusion filled her face. Why? Why you betrayed me? Why Baelish? I knew that you knew him as a child, but given his crimes, why listen to that snake? And why poison our son Robert? She shook her head. Sweet Robin. That's his name. He needs me. He sighed and then looked back at Quill, who was a stone-faced and hard-eyed presence at the door. This might take some time. It did. Lysa was afraid of him, shaking with fear, but whenever he mentioned the hated name of Petter Baelish the words bubbled perhaps that should have been babbled out of her. Dear Petter this and dear Petter that. She'd pressed John to give him position after position because she knew how good he was whilst not knowing how he was achieving that success, the corruption that spread around him, the secret loans, the theft, the bribery, the lies and of course the murders. Oh, and the poisonings. Baelish had had quite the collection of poisons in those places that he doubtless fondly thought were secret. The one that still gave him chills was the one marked Tears of Lies, along with a note that Lysa can be prevailed upon to use this if Erin starts asking awkward questions. But it was the poison that she had been giving their son that he wanted to know more about. Again why? She didn't make a lot of sense at first. He was her precious child, the miracle child, the child that she loved and who had to stay close to her, had to stay safe, had be safe, had to stay small and on her lap and drink her milk and be mothered, and if he was given the right medicine then he'd need her forever and ever and ever. And then she said the words that lightened his heart just a fraction, despite the hateful way that she hissed them, he shouldn't have been your son. He should have been Petter's son. It wasn't right. Petter should have been his father. He'd been sure that Robert was his son. He looked like an Erin. But it was good to have that final piece of proof. He looked over at Quill after she spat the words and the other man nodded as if to say that he'd heard the words and could swear witness that he'd heard them. And then Lysa let out a torrent of hatred against him for killing dear Petter, who should have been her husband. All she had to do was kill him. Why was he not dead after she had stabbed him, and Petter would come back and save her and love her and be her husband and give her more children because she deserved them and Caitlin did not with her northern savage of a husband. She became quite animated in her madness, until he finally tired of it all and stood up abruptly, making her flinch and fall silent. We have dear Petter's books and his writings, he said heavily. He seems to have seen you as a useful idiot. A clingy useful idiot. If he was in love with anyone, if such a man could love anything, then it was your sister, Caitlin Stark. Never mind. You are here and you have confessed to trying to kill me, to betraying me with Baelish, who was a traitor, and to poisoning my son and heir, the heir to the Lord Paramountcy of the Vale. If we were at the Eyrie then I'd now have ordered you dragged to the moon door by now and flung through. Instead I will execute you myself at dawn tomorrow. I should use the same means that Baelish died by, but you are or were my wife and as the mother of our child you deserve a quick death. So I'll take your head myself. Your father by the way has denounced you as being no Tully, just a disgrace. We will meet again tomorrow, one last time. Prepare yourself. And with that he turned and walked out of the door, passing Quill who was glaring at Lysa before following him out of the door. It was only after the door slammed closed and was locked firmly by Quill that they both heard the screams and the wails from Lysa. I will sharpen my sword myself, Quill, he said quietly as they walked down the corridor. And have my armor polished and a clean surcoat made ready. She has shamed House Erin and by all the gods House Erin, so the head of House Erin will execute her. Don't give me that look, Quill, I have enough strength for this. Quill bowed his head reluctantly and then strode off, leaving John with the dark thought that at some point he would have to tell his son that he had personally executed his mother. But it had to be done. As high as honor. He could do no less. Daenerys. Her dragons were trying to learn how to fly. It was instinctive, or so the books said. She wondered about the books at times. Dry words on dry pages, with many theories across them. There were times when she looked at the range of books and wanted to droop, to lower her head against the table and cry. She was so alone. Oh, the servants were friendly and the food they produced was excellent. She walked twice a day in the hills around Bolt Hole, knowing that there would always be an Unsullied guard somewhere in sight watching for threats, but she knew that despite the others she was as alone as she had been in Pentos after the fire. There were times when she almost wished that Viserys was still alive. Yes, in his last days he must have been as mad as she now knew that father had been, but he had still been family and above all he had been a Valyrian. Valyria. It haunted her dreams at times. A great empire reduced to ashes by, what? What had the Doom been? There were a lot more theories in the books about the Doom. Some said that it had been a fireball from the sky. Others that it had been a fireball from the sea. Some said that it had been from the ground itself, that the Valyrians had twisted the land, misused its magic until eventually something had broken and warped in a terrible way. Whatever the cause, Valyria was now gone. Anyone who went there never came back. The Valyrians had known everything about dragons though, and she wished that even just one of them could be there with her, to teach her dragons. She had finally named them. The little black one was Balerion, because why not? It was an illustrious name. The green one was Rorgal, after her brother. She was a bit confused about that one, but in the books it seemed to make sense. And the white one she had named after her great-great and then something Eamon. She really hoped that she had gotten the Valyrian names right. And now she was watching as her dragons tried to fly. They were fumbling. They were falling and she had to rush in several times to pick them up and stroke them and reassure them and then place them back on the bench on which they were perched. But they were starting to fly. To glide at least, with a few flaps of the wing. She was willing them to fly. She wanted them to fly. They would fly. It would happen in the next few days. And it both encouraged her and terrified her. They had to fly. The last dragon that her family had possessed had been a stunted thing that had never really flown. Why had it not? Had it been a plot against her family? So her dragons had to fly, had to keep growing, had to become big and strong. But what if they flew away somewhere and never came back? They were her children. And she didn't want to be alone. She'd written another letter to her great-grand-uncle on the wall, begging him for any wisdom he could give her. She didn't know when or even if he would respond to her, but she hoped he would. She hoped. Varys had at least sent her a letter. It had made her feel ill, because it had confirmed the news that her father had been truly mad, that there had indeed been wildfire under the Red Keep and so many other places. And he had added a postscript, telling of what Prince Oberyn's daughter had seen at the wall. Of wights and actual others out of legend. The thought of those things, dead people walking and creatures that looked as if they were carved from ice, made her shiver, even though she was perfectly warm here in deserted Andalos. So what to do? Varys had made it very clear that the Targaryen cause in Westeros was at a low ebb, lower than it had ever been, at the moment. But there were creatures from her blackest nightmares marching on the wall, and she felt an odd call west. She had not heard the call, but perhaps she sensed it thanks to the trickle of Blackwood blood in her. If there was no support in Westeros, then why go there? But if she felt that pull, then surely she had to. It was all enough to give her a headache at times. Varys had it right, she had been pushed out of the nest and now she had to learn to fly, just as much as her dragons. Because the ground was rushing up before her. She heard the sound of boots and then looked over to see one of the Unsullied standing before her. He nodded sharply and then removed his helmet. Ah! It was Grey Slime, and once again she cursed the men who had named the individual Unsullied. Lady Targaryen. She didn't correct him. She didn't know if she was a princess still or not. May I help you? She would not call him by that name. Word from Pentos has come. The Bravosi are looking for you. Hunting you perhaps. We should be safe here, but we will still set guards. She froze for a moment and then sighed and nodded. Very well. I will write to Lord Varys. The Unsullied replaced his helmet, nodded formally and then walked off, but then she raised her voice again. Unsullied. He turned and looked back at her. You and your brothers need new names. Free names. I will write as such to Lord Varys. For the first time she saw genuine shock in the eyes of one of the Unsullied. He nodded again, more briskly, and then left quickly, leaving her to watch the antics of her dragons, with little Balerion finally taking to the skies with a great flapping of wings. She hoped that she'd get a response from the wall. Asher. She loved the sea. Being back on a ship had made her sigh with relief, but they'd been on a river at first and rivers were not the sea. Rivers limited your course, rivers had too many shallows, rivers hemmed you in. The sea was different. The smell of the spray, the sound of the gulls, the sight of the dolphins gambolling alongside the ship as they cut through the waves, it felt like she could, wind willing, steer her ship anywhere in the world on a whim. She looked ahead from her current perch at the crow's nest on the mainmast. She felt as if she had been away from Harlaw for a year instead of the months that it had been. No further news of battles or skirmishes had come from the Iron Islands and she'd been both encouraged and made nervous by that. She knew that the peace would only last for a short time, until Nuncle Roderick met Father, and she had no idea what Father was planning. It still made her uneasy, that she could not trust Father anymore, but there was no other way to view the matter. Father had thrown his lot in with Damfair, who was just insane, and after all her time in the north, what she had not just heard of but actually seen in front of her eyes, she knew that that was madness. Barrowtown had left a mark on her. Seeing those things in the mist had chilled her very blood. She shivered a little and then looked down. Grit was at the prow, looking out at the waves with a look of awe on her face. The wilderling girl had stopped throwing up all over the place, which was a mercy, and was watching the sea with a look of wonder. John Bloody Stark had better treat that girl well. Something tickled in her nose for a moment and she looked ahead again, narrowing her eyes a little, before taking a look at where the sun was in the sky. Given the wind, how long they'd been sailing, could it be Harlaw already on the far horizon? It was. The island loomed before them after a while and she descended down to the deck and took the helm herself, peering ahead at the landmarks and then setting a course for 10 Towers. She could tell that they were being watched from the shore, and the moment that she clapped eyes on the island she had the banner of House Harlaw and her own personal standard hoisted. Nuncle Roderick needed to know that she was back as soon as possible. That said, she was glad to see a pair of ships ahead of them as they sailed down the coast to 10 Towers. Guard ships. She used her Mirish spyglass to view them and saw a man with one looking back at her. They passed with waves of acknowledgement and something of a weight came off her shoulders. Harlaw still stood. By the time that they finally beat into the harbour at 10 Towers she could see that a crowd had assembled at the wharf. And at the head of the crowd was a familiar figure. Lord Roderick Harlaw was there. She took a deep breath. She was not looking forwards to this. As the ship was steered towards the wharf and the sails were furled, the passengers started to assemble on the deck, and as Stannis Baratheon emerged, surcoat of yellow and black on his chest and flanked by his guards, the crowd saw him and started to mutter. This was what she had been afraid of. Iron Islanders still remembered and resented the Battle of Fair Isle. Greenlanders weren't supposed to win sea battles against Ironborn, and yet, led by Stannis Baratheon, they had smashed the Iron Fleet at Fair Isle. But then, as she snapped the orders that brought the ship to moor at the wharf and the crowd really started to mutter, something else happened. Jon Stark and Theon both made an appearance on deck with their direwolves. Jon was wearing a Stark surcoat and Theon his grey mist one, but her brother also held a Stark banner in his hands. And the moment that the direwolves padded into view the crowd fell silent. The moment that the mooring was complete and the railed gangplank went down, Stannis Baratheon strode down it, not even touching the handrails. His guards followed him, along with Jon and Theon and their direwolves, with Asher trailing. At first Nuncle Roderick's white and strained face was focused on the Baratheon on the dock, and she knew that he had to be thinking of his dead sons. But then she could see his eyes take in the fist pin on the chest of the other man. "My Lord Hand." He said the words flatly but then bowed formally, and she let out a sigh of almost relief as she heard him say those 3 words. "Lord Harlaw." Stannis Baratheon nodded in recognition before looking about. "The Iron Throne recognizes your voice here. And supports you." The Iron Throne heard the call as well. There was another bout of muttering that ended as Nuncle Roderick bowed again, even more deeply. "My thanks, my Lord Hand." And then he looked at Jon Stark. "You would be a Stark then? A son of Lord Stark?" The young man who looked so much like his father nodded at that and then took a step forwards, one hand on the head of his very alert direwolf. "I am Jon Stark, the son of Eddard Stark. You can all see my direwolf, Ghost, here." And I was there, with Lord Greymist here, when the call was sent. The others come. The Stark calls for aid. He took a deep breath. You are needed. There was a moment of stunned silence and then the crowd erupted into wild cheering. She closed her eyes and sighed deeply as she released the strain that had been on her. When she opened her eyes, Nuncle Roderick was standing in front of her. I hoped that you'd bring a letter of support from the king, not the hand of the king. He sighed and gave her a strained smile. Stannis Baratheon is an awkward man. That said, he'll be the marlinspike to the head that your father won't expect. There'll be more than one marlinspike to the head, she muttered, as she jerked a thumb in the direction of Theon, who was still standing there with his bloody direwolf. Lord Greymist. He's my brother Theon. Nuncle Roderick eyed Theon and his direwolf and then looked back at her. You what? He's renounced the Greyjoy name and heritage. Says that the moment that father started to rebuild the Iron Fleet he also all but gave up on him. She paused for a long and reluctant moment. He speaks the truth, to be honest. There was a moment of silence and then her uncle started to laugh. So he said eventually, your brother has inflicted his own form of vengeance on your father. You are now his only heir. I am. She almost spat the words. Nuncle Roderick nodded again. Good, you deserve to be. He looked at Stannis Baratheon and Jon and Theon. We need to get them all up to the towers. Nuncle, there's lot I need to tell you about. And I need to ask you about what the Stonerbrows said about me passing on what I know to my sons. She cringed a little. Nuncle, that must have been because my wife is pregnant. He said the words with a certain astonishment and wonder in his voice. She blinked at that. Nuncle, she said eventually. You old dog. To her amusement he blushed. Asher, I'm only human. Sander. Life was good right now. The sun was shining, there was a mug of very good ale to one side, he had a belly full of excellent food and above all there was a giggling maid on his lap who had the kind of tits that a man could bury his face in. Which is what he'd done the previous night. And from the giggling things she was whispering in his ear he'd be doing the same thing that night and a lot more. He needed the distraction because he still had not the faintest fucking idea what he was going to do. Somewhere a raven was flapping its way south to Casterly Rock, to tell whoever was in charge there that a message had to be sent to Clegane's keep saying that he was now the head of House Clegane, or what there was of it. It currently consisted of him. Just him. He wondered for a moment what his father would have thought about things. And then he stopped himself from thinking about that. He didn't want to get angry, not now. Not with Beth whispering the kind of things in his ear that made him want to pick her up and take her back to his room. And then they both froze as a door opened to one side and the sound of screamed insults and general madness started to reach them. They looked over to one side as the imp stumped into view, looking angry and strained, followed by his wife, who was flexing a hand but looked grimly satisfied. Oh shit, that's the queen of bitches, Beth muttered, and sure enough after a moment two guards emerged with a struggling figure. Cersei fucking Lannister. She looked haggard and thinner than before, her hair was disarrayed, there were black circles under her eyes, she was not dressed in anything fashionable and all in all she looked like shit. Oh, and there was the red mark on her cheek that looked like a slap mark. He looked at the imp's wife and her right hand, which she was flexing a lot, put two and two together and came to the correct conclusion. The imp's northern wife had a fire in her belly. Good for her. And then the former queen laid eyes on him. Hound. She screeched the word. Dog. Come here and rescue me. Kill these northern swine. I command it. I command it. I am your queen. Fuck it, but she sounded demented. Did she really still think that she was queen, after everything that she had done? After everything that happened as a result? She'd been caught fucking her own brother, had his bastard children, had committed treason. If he'd had the horrific luck to be married to her, then she would have lost her head months or even years ago. So he looked Cersei Lannister right in her mad eyes and then just grinned. It was a big grin and he saw her start as she realized that his burns were gone. And then he laughed. This seemed to flabbergast her. All hail the Queen of Nothing, he shouted, making Beth jump a little on his lap in a very nice way. Clegane. She shouted back. How dare you? You're not the queen anymore, he replied with a shrug. Command away. I'm not listening. She went into some kind of frenzy after that, struggling against her guards, until the imp's wife strode up to her again. Good sister, she said in a voice like silk-shrouded steel, you will be silent or you will get the taste of my hand again. Cersei Lannister fell suddenly silent at that, one hand going to the slap mark on her face. You dared. I did, and I'll do it again if I have to. Stop making a spectacle of yourself. Be silent. Try and be a Lannister, with dignity. Her eyes widened almost comically at this, as she almost reeled backwards at the words that Daisy Sherestone Lannister, or whatever the fuck her name now was, had flung in her face. He had to admire her. She had balls for a woman and was a match for the imp. And now the imp strode forwards, with a face that oddly enough looked very much like his old bastard of a father. Enough, Cersei. You have embarrassed House Lannister enough. No more. You are to go into exile and accept that. Pale and shaking, the bitch looked around the courtyard, at the imp and his wife, at the still forms of Robb Stark and that odd wilderling girl with the big tits to one side, and at the distant red-headed figure of Catelyn Stark. She seemed to almost prepare to hawk and spit on the ground in front of her, but then the imp shook his head with a dreadful finality. No, he said the word in such a way that he sounded just like his father. And that seemed to break something in her. She wilted and was led to the waiting carriage to one side. The imp sighed and walked over to the men and women who were waiting by it as the former queen was ushered into the carriage. My sister will be a challenge to deal with. However, and here he held up a jingling bag of what must have been coins. Deliver her safely to White Harbor, and this will the first of 2 bags of silver for your pains. The other awaits you in White Harbor. Please do not listen to her many and insane lies about what she might promise you. The grizzled older man who accepted the bag nodded formally. We'll get her there safely, Lord Tyrion. And put her on the boat to that island she's bound for. And that was it, really. They were all prepared to depart, it seemed, and after they mounted and passed out of the gate in front of them, a sigh seemed to go up and attention seemed to lift. Well then, Beth said. She's gone. And good riddance to her. He stood then, with her in his arms, which made her squeak again. She's gone. My room. She looked at him, mischief and more than that in her eyes. Your room. And so he strode off with her. Whatever his duty was, it could wait. For a while. He had a growing feeling he was needed somewhere. Theon. Mother had sung songs about 10 Towers to Asher and himself when they were very young, songs that he vaguely remembered even now. Songs about how big and tall the towers were, how much wisdom the lords of Harlaw had, how beautiful Harlaw was. And now he was on the island and could see what at least one of the Iron Islands was like, and he wasn't impressed. He hated to say it, but it was true. Harlaw was nothing like the North. Where were the trees, where were the mountains, where were the resources? If he had learned anything from Lord Stark over the past years that he had been in the North, it was that you always had a running total in your head of what the lands around you could yield up. Crops. Livestock. Ores. Lumber. People. Hunting grounds. Fishing grounds. Harlaw barely ticked off a few of those. He could see why the Iron Islands needed lumber. There were some trees, but nowhere near as many as even the rockier part of the North. He thought of the wolf's wood and wanted to shake his head. Mist padded up to him and waffled at his hand until he grinned at his direwolf and scratched behind his ears until Mist closed his eyes in ecstasy and leaned into his hand, as a rear paw started to beat a lazy tattoo on the floorboards. Knuckles rapped on the door an instant after Mist suddenly turned to look at the door, giving him the slightest of warnings. Nuncle Roderick was standing the doorway, watching them both carefully. Theon. Nuncle. The older man strode in, stopped and looked him up and down. You have the look of your mother about you. But speaking as a Harlaw, I would say that, wouldn't I? He smiled slightly. You have the open mind of a Harlaw, anyway, Harlaw. He thought about the Theon that Robb knew from that future that never would be and smiled wryly. I'll always try to have a more open mind than my father. The reader pulled a face. You know what I think about your father from our letters. He's not the Greyjoy his father was. Ironically, perhaps you could have been. Your sister will have to be it instead, as you have tied yourself to the North so completely. I had to, he replied, stroking mist between the ears absently. Nuncle, I was there in Winterfell when the call was sent out. I was in Lord Stark's solar when it was sent. It ran through me like nothing else I have ever felt. And then he took a deep breath. Nuncle, I have seen the wall. I have seen whites. I have killed them. And I have seen others. I know what's coming for all of us. His uncle looked at him and then nodded slowly, before squinting at him. Asher says that you have a weirwood pendant and a tale that I must hear. He pulled the pendant out and then sighed slightly and told his uncle the full tale of both dreams. By the time he finished, the reader staring at him with an odd, set look to his face. After a long moment his uncle finally nodded slowly as he visibly thought things through. That he said hoarsely, and then he coughed and seemed to shake himself. That explains a great deal about your actions, Theon. I understand better than most. Did Asher tell you about the room of runes that was found at High Harlaw? She did. And what the runes meant? Our ancestors knew something. Something that frightened them. He nodded in turn and then he sighed. Did Asher tell you about what we saw at Barrowtown? The reader frowned a little. She did not. What happened? So one again he told the tale of what they and all who had been on the wall at Barrowtown, looking at that eerie mist, had seen. When he stopped speaking he could see that his uncle was deeply shaken. The timing fits. Fits what? His uncle strode over to a chair and sat down. Odd fog was seen on the northeasternmost part of Harlaw, more than 10 days ago. It wouldn't move with the wind. And then, after an odd light was in the sky on the far horizon, it vanished. Based on your take and the times, they fit. Theon found himself shivering for a moment. The shades of the dead. Those who wanted to go to the Oathstone to join the others there. He paused for a moment and then frowned. Was fog reported on any of the other islands? Great WYK. The reader sighed a little. We have some scattered reports from some of the other islands of something similar. Fog that gathered in places for days before vanishing on the same day. He nodded slowly. No word from my father on the fog. This got him a bitter smile from his uncle. No. No word. Then he paused and ran a hand over his forehead. Your mother is here at 10 Towers. She has not been well for some years now. She mourned your brothers deeply and your father never understood the depth of her grief. But she heard the call. Heard it loudly. She's more focused now. Better. You should see her. Mother. His heart seemed to stop for a moment. I have not seen her in years. She will welcome the sight of you. His uncle looked at Mist and then quirked a smile. I am not sure what she will make of your direwolf though. He laughed softly and then ruffled Mist's fur between his ears. She'll understand that Mist and I are as one. I might not be a warg, like some of the Starks, but there are times when I wonder what it might take to be one. The reader nodded slowly, before looking out of the window. I will be taking the Lord Hand to High Harlaw, so that he can see the runes. You should come, to see them. He paused and winced a little. Your other uncle, Victorian, has seen them. You should see him too. The runes have changed him. Changed him how? He wants to go to the wall. He wants to see things for himself. He'll have a limp for the rest of his life. He was wounded in the battle here, but he has a more open mind than he used to. And I take it that a message has gone to my father, to meet. To parley. Uncle Roderick sighed. It has. And I have no doubt that your father will do something stupid during it. But having Stannis Baratheon there as the hand of the king, and you as Lord Greymist will be a reef that he won't be expecting. And with that he stood, nodded at him and then left. Theon watched him go and then went back to the window. He really wanted to be back in the north. He wanted to be building his holdfast, picking his people, and he wanted Ros. He put a hand to his weirwood pendant and sent up a brief prayer to the old gods. He wanted to finish this business and go home. Chapter 48. Chapter text. Robert. Gods, but he'd missed this. Riding on campaign again, the greatest campaign in the history of Westeros, certainly since the conquest, was something that made him feel alive again. He'd missed this, riding at the head of what was almost a vanguard of an army, heading towards a battlefield. And what a battlefield! The further north they rode, the more he saw why it was that Ned had never returned to King's Landing after the war. He was too busy running the north and trying to grow it. The north was huge and harsh. It was cold, and the further north they rode, the colder it got. Ned had given him a lot of advice about what to wear, and their party had benefited from those words of wisdom. Even his former good father had listened, to his quiet amusement. Hidden and quiet, obviously. He was being careful in how he treated the man. The resources of the Westerlands, their gold and silver especially, would be vital in the war that lay ahead. And he had to be careful about that as well. He'd cursed himself for the way that he'd stupidly scorned Jon's worries about counting coppers. That had led to Baelish and his contemptuous pilfering of the treasury. He didn't like to think of that smirking little piece of shit. He'd never liked him. There had always been something that made his hackles go up whenever they talked. Like an idiot, he'd never wondered why. That made him wonder just what Baelish would have thought of the Whiteheads and all the other evidence of the others. Probably would have sneered at them and called them Northern lies or something like that, and then tried to persuade him not to support the North. Well, the North had to be fucking well supported. The wall was their best defense. It was enormous and would probably eat resources like nothing he could imagine, but he'd work out the tactics once he got there and could see the lay of the land. He had no intention of being the king who lost this war. The Targaryens had been fighting for power and the right to stay on that damn chair that he should have melted down years ago. He was fighting to keep Westeros safe and well and filled with living people. These others, they wanted to kill everyone and everything and then raise the dead as whites to dance to whatever tune they liked, if they even had music. That was the thing that bothered him, the strangeness, the wrongness of the enemy. With men you knew what they were fighting for: love, or coin, or power, or hate, or loyalty, or a combination of all of those. But these others, what did they fight for? Death. He'd known men who fought because they wanted to die, but this was different. It made him uneasy in a different way. He had a part to play in this, a role that the gods had chosen for him. Storm King. But what did that mean? What could he do? He couldn't control the clouds, he couldn't make lightning strike or thunder boom. What did they want of him? He had to work it out. He would also have to ride up and down the column again soon, Stormbreaker in his arms. The word about the mountain had spread quickly, and it was expected of him now that he'd use the sword of his ancestors to try and detect any foul magics being used on the men. He had no idea if he could even tell, but from what the imp had wrote, the warnings had glowed near the body of Gregor Clegane. So far Stormbreaker hadn't so much as flickered, and Sir Barristan had been keeping a close eye on it as they rode. That said, just seeing him had gotten the men's spirits up, and that was important. A king who forgot that was no king. Aes had shown that. Well, that, and being an insane dribbling lunatic who was willing to sacrifice King's Landing in his delusion that doing so would make him a dragon. He understood all too well why young Jon was so terrified of his Targaryen blood. There were times when the thought of going mad worried him as well. He was only on the throne because of his family link to the Targaryens. He was finally coming to terms with that now. Yes, he hated Rhaegar for kidnapping and raping Lyanna. Yes, he hated Aes for being a cruel lunatic who had condemned him and Ned to death for just existing. But his grandmother had been a Targaryen and he had loved her fiercely. He could never hate her. That realization had been like a key turning in a lock in his head. As the sun started to draw down to the horizon in the west, they found themselves at a large inn, where the innkeeper had been expecting them thanks to the advance riders, and where there were quarters for all, even if some of the men had to sleep in a barn to one side with carefully tended braziers inside. He made sure that everyone was settled, a lesson that Jon Arryn had drummed into him, and then made for his own room, where there was a hip bath ready with hot water in it and a giant scrubbing brush, the application of which on his back made his eyes cross with pleasure. After that he made for the common room and joined the others in eating and drinking. He was tired, gods, they all were, and he realized that he needed to keep a clear head, so he swallowed the ale and didn't ask for wine. And even though there was a comely wench or three about with magnificent tits, he didn't indulge in too much flirting. The ghost of Lyanna seemed to be at his shoulder at times, and he had not yet thought on how to release that wraith of memory. He needed to, gods, she had told him to. But he couldn't yet work how to do it. He did watch, amused, at how Gendry's eyes tended to widen at some of the women in the room. His son was, well, shy. He was young, coltish, and a good lad. And, above all, no one was trying to kill him. He'd thought long and dark thoughts about that after Stannis had told him about the attempts on the way to Winterfell. Cersei, of course. Gendry also seemed to be always staring at a piece of ruined metal. He needed to ask the lad about that. And with that he shrugged and went to bed, where he slept the sleep of the knackered. When morning came he indulged in his usual ritual of hoisting a log over his shoulders and striding about the courtyard as the inn came alive and the men started to make ready for the day's ride. He added an extra circuit before shrugging the log off and then standing there panting, leaning over with his hands on his thighs, before pouring a bucket of warm water over his head and then going back to his room to dress and then join the others in breaking their fast. And then to horse again. They made good progress that morning. And then just before noon, as they were stopping to have a spot of lunch, he heard shouts off to the distance. Looking over he could see a party of horsemen approaching from the north, with upraised hands of welcome and a banner that he recognized. And there was a huge man leading them on a large horse. Umber. The large man looked in his direction as he dismounted and Robert could see a flash of grinning teeth and hear a boom of laughter. "Get your skinny ass over here, Umber. Is that our loud king?" He could feel Selmy stiffen next to him and he raised a calming hand. "It's all right, Sir Barristan. That's Lord Umber the Great John. He's short on tact and long on boisterousness." "What's tact?" The Great John boomed as he approached and then knelt formally. "Your Grace. Welcome to the north." He looked up. "I am bloody glad to see you, but my knee's getting damp and as you said I have no tact." The laughter bubbled out of him and he reached out, grabbed the Great John's arm and jerked him effortless to his feet, before clapping him on the shoulder. "Great John. Haven't seen you since Pike." "Aye, Your Grace. Good times for squid squashing." The huge man sobered for a moment. "It's good to see you, Your Grace. The call was sent and the South has answered. I heard that you were on the road to the wall. Where's Lord Stark?" He jerked his head to one side and led the huge man off to one side. "Old Town," he said eventually. "Ned's headed for Old Town." Catching the Great John's frown he quietly explained the message from the new Lord Tyrell. By the time he had finished explaining, the Lord of the Last Hearth was pale. "Bloody hell," Umber said eventually. "Well, I hope that Ned sorts that out. In the meantime I came to see you for a reason, Your Grace. To warn that there's giants in the hills to the northwest of here. They trade with men a bit, so there's every chance you'll see them on the road. And they're a bloody great shock to the system if you're not ready for them. I know that your horses won't be. I thought a warning might help." He frowned. "They're not a threat, are they? Not unless you're a threat to them. They don't even eat meat. Make great cheese though." Robert eyed the man for a moment. "Any cousins of yours there?" The Great John boomed with laughter. "If Umber family legends are true, then yes. Odd to think that I might have family there." He shrugged and then looked flintily to one side. "I seem to smell Lannisters." He suppressed a wince. "Tywin Lannister is riding with me to the wall, with others including his brothers." The big man. "Brothers? Geryon. You've met him. At Castle Black. Not bad for a Lannister." Someone called from the group to their rear and he slapped the Great John on the shoulder again. "Have some lunch and ride with us for a while. There's a lot I need to know about the North." It was good to have the Great John at his side. The man looked big and threatening but had a surprisingly shrewd mind. After they resumed their ride north after lunch, gods, that man could eat and drink. He rode next to him and filled in a few gaps in his knowledge about the North. Where they could see habitation they also saw a huge amount of work being done, to sow or harvest or chop. A lot of firewood was being laid down to dry out and he even saw signs of a few coal mines here and there. And according to the Great John there soon would be some shaggier cows. Umber had a plan that made sense to him at least. And then they reached an area where the trees by the left-hand side of the road became thinner and gave way to hills covered in grass. Umber paused them here and shouted out his warning that there were giants in the hills on their mammoths and that they all had to be mindful of their horses. More than a few horsemen in Lannister Red scoffed almost openly at that, muttering to each other. The Great John noticed that, he could see at once, smirked more than a bit and then nodded at his king to ride on. When the first huge shapes of giants on mammoths were seen, there were more than a few startled shouts and pale faces, although Geryon Lannister joined the Great John in reassuring people. One group of giants, with mammoths to one side, was close to the road, dickering with what looked like some men dressed in bronze armor. Then the Great John said quietly, "Deathan. Wildlings." His face worked for a long moment before he sighed. "The best of the wildlings. They obey Ned and enforce the law in the gift and the new gift. Never thought I'd say those words. Always thought that all wildlings were scum." He coughed a little. I was wrong." He peered at the man carefully and then nodded. "There's a lot of it going about," he replied wryly, before looking at some of the riders about him. Young Lancel Lannister was staring at the giants in such a way that he seemed about to faint with astonishment. Which was a bad thing, because when the wind shifted slightly and blew down from the direction of the mammoths, more than a few horses became skittish. He reassured his own horse with a pat and a caress, as did the Great John. And then the Lannister boy's horse got a good whiff of something and neighed. The boy was too busy gaping at the giants to seem to notice, and then the horse reared onto its hind legs for a moment. Lancel Lannister swore and then went flying, only to be snatched out of the air by the great arm of the Great John, who grabbed him with a grunt and then lowered him to the ground as someone else calmed the horse. "There you go, boy," the Great John boomed. "You all right?" The young man seemed to shake himself, looked humiliated and then nodded. "My thanks, Lord Umber," he said after a long moment. "I owe you a great debt." He could see a very pale Kevan Lannister to one side also nodding at the Great John, who acknowledged them both with a tight smile. "You're welcome, lad." After the lad had mounted his horse again and they all rode on, he noticed that the giants had all stopped dead and were watching them closely, along with Dathan after a moment. The Great John also noticed this and after getting a nod of permission from him rode off to talk to them. When he returned, the Lord of the Last Hearth was pale. He rode up next to him and then eyed him from head to toe. "What's amiss?" "The giants." "What about them?" They asked who the Storm Man was. "The human who brings the thunder and lightning in his wake. The man with the sword of storms." He paled a little and then looked back at the giants and men in bronze who were staring at him. Gods! What was he? What did he need to be? Jon Arryn. He still had strength in his arm and a good eye. He knew that. He knew it because that morning, just after dawn, he'd killed his wife with that arm and that eye. That and a very sharp sword. She had been brought to the block dull-eyed and muttering nonsense. Something about darling Petter and babies. He wanted to tell her that her Petter was squatting in one of the nastier hells somewhere that was reserved for thieves and cuckolds, but he could tell at a glance that his words would have been worthless, that she would not have heard them. She had been lost to madness and had been there for some time. So instead he pricked at her back with the point of his sword, just enough to make her arch her back and stretch her neck in shocked surprise, and then he had picked the spot on her neck to aim for and swung. He had struck hard and true and his sword had severed her neck with one blow. He'd been glad that her head had fallen with her face to the ground. He didn't want to see her last moments, her eyes rolling, her mouth trying to open and scream. She had been his wife, she had birthed his son, and yes, then she had betrayed him and then tried to kill him. Now she was with the Silent Sisters. Her bones would be taken back to the Vale and quietly buried near the Bloody Gate. Not the Eyrie. She'd never be buried there. Or at her old home in the Riverlands. It was a form of revenge beyond death. Petty perhaps, but one day he'd have to sit down with his son and explain to him why he'd done what he had. Why he had executed the lad's mother. She had loved him, in a twisted way. She'd also poisoned the boy, and if Baelish had lived, who knew if that twisted little maggot would have persuaded her to poison him as well. So much evil had followed from Baelish being fostered at Riverrun. And speaking of the Riverlands, he was now looking at a new issue involving the lands that bordered the Vale. The shield of the Riverlands looked so old. Old but somehow enduring. The shape of it was ancient, the metal on it so like that of Stormbreaker, the leather old, worn but somehow still supple. There were 3 others in the room. Quill, a silent watcher who he knew was worried about him, and then Bronn and his steward, who had changed into a dress. They were all looking at the shield and waiting. A knock at the door was answered by Quill, who stepped to one side to admit Pycelle, who was holding several books and who looked almost excited as he sat down and then looked at the shield with what looked rather like greed. "Well, my lords," the Archmaester said with a smile. "Quite the ancient mystery. Is this indeed the shield of the Riverlands, Archmaester?" The books were placed carefully on the table. "The shield is something out of the age of legends that vanished during the Andal invasion, my lords. We have very few references to it. We know that it was owned by the Mud Kings. Legend has it that bearing it raised the spirits of the men in battle. Legend also had it that when it was raised in the air at the right time it would shine like the sun itself." At these last words Bronn and his steward looked at each other, before the Lord of the Foxhold looked at the old Archmaester and then at him. "Archmaester, when Ursula here first picked the shield up, it shone. Like a piece of the sun was in it." Pycelle looked as if he was torn between scoffing and looking faintly impressed. "You are sure about that, Lord Castle?" "Quite sure." Corlish said the words without quite biting them off. Even Pycelle, it seemed, could detect the dislike in her voice, because he suddenly harumphed and then pulled over one of the books and leafed carefully through it. As for the ownership of the shield, whilst it might be named for the Riverlands, it was an heirloom of House Mud, which of course is not entire extinguished and which married into House Corlish. Steward Corlish is of that blood, and whilst the Foxhold was, fought over by Riverlands and Vale over the years, its current situation in the Vale is not disputed. Therefore, my lords, Steward Corlish, there can be no claim by Riverrun on this, object." Jon nodded with a sigh. "Excellent." Then he caught the look on Pycelle's face. "What is it, Archmaester?" "Well, there is the issue of wielding it, my lord. The other great artifacts of the First Men are currently carried by men His Grace the King, Lord Stark, Lord Tyrell, Lord Dane, if Dawn is indeed a blade of the First Men, and Lord Tyrion Lannister. Steward Corlish is, she is but a woman, to put things bluntly." Ursula Corlish fixed the old man with a look that reminded Jon at once of her father. Geordie Corlish had had the exact same look of magnificent disdain. "Archmaester," she said after a long moment, "may I remind you that I am of noble blood and that the shield shone when I picked it up, as Lord Castle attested to." This prompted a moment of gabbling vacillation from the wretched man, before Bronn put an end to it. "She can wield it. I think she was born to wield it. And no one should take it away from her or tell her that she's too weak. She's not. She heard the call. And that's that." He smiled slightly at the way that she was looking at the former sellsword who was displaying such remarkable hidden depths. And then he made a decision. "That is not quite the end of it, Lord Castle. I think that there is a ceremony that I need to organize right here in the Red Keep, and I think that there is a vitally important question that you need to ask the daughter of the late Lord Corlish that is linked to that ceremony." As he gestured to a faintly baffled Pycelle and a slightly smirking Quill to leave the room with him, he could tell that Bronn had gone very white but resolute, and that Ursula Corlish had blushed bright red but looked expectant. If they survived the war that lay ahead, the children of those two would be interesting. Robb. Running the North in father's absence was something that never became easier. So much to do, a never-ending stream of things to read, think about and sign, or sometimes just read and sign, or sometimes read, sigh and sign. Which he had just done as he sat in father's solar. He still had the feeling that his education about how to really rule the North had barely begun, although that was probably being harsh of him. That said, the last time he had been in at least titular charge of the North he'd ended up with crossbow bolts in his chest and a knife wielded by Roose Bolton ending his life. Was he more cautious now? Yes. He was. Was he also being a fool when it came to his heart before his head? Possibly. Mors Umber was now in Winterfell, along with young Ned Umber. The boy was a bit young and more than a bit overwhelmed, especially by the terrible threesome, but he had a good heart. Arya was so far utterly unimpressed by him. Well, perhaps that might change. As for Mors Crowfoot, he was, frankly, a force of nature. His height and powerful build were extended by the snowbearcloak, and his ability to drink vast quantities of ale were already making him something of a, some regarded him with awe and some thought he was a rowdy drunk. Rowan, the mother of Val and Dalla, would be at Winterfell in the next day or so, and he was feeling extremely anxious about that. Was he being a fool about this? He knew what father wanted for the north. The wildlings added to the population of the land, turned from enemies into northerners, expanding the population of the land. Val was someone extraordinary. Beautiful, deadly, intelligent and someone who intoxicated his senses. He wanted to back away at times. He knew what his last mistake had cost him. In the meantime he had also been wandering about Winterfell, grey wind at his heels, looking for something that he had not the faintest idea about. The Green Man had told him to search for hidden things, but what could be hidden? He'd stared at the map of Winterfell for far too long and then walked the walls and stared down at it. Was there a lost building somewhere? If there was, then there was no sign of it. Was there therefore somewhere underground? But they had been through Winterfell after father had been given the Hearthstone and found nothing. He paused and drummed his fingers on the table. That said, they hadn't found the annex in the crypts with the graves of the wargs until after father had been possessed by the spirit of one of their ancestors. He couldn't count on a similar possession. He was missing something. He just didn't know what. And so he left the solar and went out into the main courtyard. The terrible threesome were nowhere in sight, probably because Shireen and what Bran had named her wagging finger of scolding had scared them off somewhere. From the strains of a harp in the distance, Domeric was also somewhere nearby, and where Domeric was, Sansa would be too. Those two were a good union, especially as Domeric was nothing really like his father. There were times when he thought very dark thoughts about Roose Bolton. And then other times when he forced himself back from those thoughts. He had a nagging feeling that he needed to look deeper into Winterfell. The broken tower was being repaired, as was the first keep. The more he thought about the hidden room in Father's solar, the more he wondered if that had been an earlier tower that had been enclosed within the building that had enveloped it. This needed a maester really, but as Lewin was rather busy with Mother and the other pregnant ladies of Winterfell, he couldn't really vex him with all of this. Perhaps he needed to walk through the crypts again. It might not hurt. Jon Stark. As the coast of Harlaw vanished astern at dawn, he stole a look at Theon. He was standing on the starboard side of the ship, his hand on Mist's head. He really did seem to gain strength from the direwolf. Jon did not approach the pair. He knew what he was thinking. He was preparing to meet his father and reject everything he stood for. He looked back at the helmsman. The reader was standing next to him, talking quietly to Asher Greyjoy. The older man was the opposite of everything he'd thought the Ironborn to be. He was quiet but authoritative, studious but still fierce when he had to be. The moment that he'd shown them the room with the glowing runes had been one that would remain in his memory for many years to come. It had shaken them all. Off to one side was a pale Grit who, wonder of wonders, was not retching over the side. The wilderling girl that he had such an odd relationship with was obviously concentrating furiously on the reader's advice on how not to get seasick. The reader bellowed a series of orders at his men that caused them to pull on various ropes whilst releasing others, and after a moment he felt the ship shiver slightly as it started to somehow slip through the waves even faster. "I," said Asher as she approached him, and then looked up at the sails. "Mine uncle knows his bloody business. We'll be there well before sunset." He pulled a slight face. "What will your father do when he hears that we're coming?" The Ironborn woman, she was no girl, not now, stared ahead and set her face a little as she battled with what to say. "Depends on what he's heard. Ships go back and forth between the islands with the truce. But we left the day after you arrived, so he might not know that Stannis Baratheon's sailing with us, and he definitely won't know that Theon's renounced his name. We know that there's a good chance that we're sailing into what my father thinks is a trap, but we have the people we need to let the jaws of that trap snap shut on empty air." Jon looked at the other ships around them, with Harlaw pennants snapping stiffly in the wind. Hopefully she was right. They were blessed with that same brisk wind for the rest of the day, a westward wind that drove straight for Pike like an arrow leaving a bow, and Jon wondered if they would have the same impact once they hit their target. Balon Greyjoy's world was about to be changed in every way possible. Along the way they passed fishing vessels, manned by a combination of Ironborn and people who could only be thralls, something that made him genuinely angry at the thought of it. Some of the crew of the ships they passed looked at them curiously, some cheered and others had an oddly conflicted look to them. On they went, and Jon found himself wondering how far ahead of them the pinnace that the reader had sent before them was now. The small craft was fast but didn't look as sturdy as some of the others did, but that said it was fast. As they approached Pike, as the island eventually started to loom on the western horizon, he found out how fast. There was a shout from the mast, arms were pointed, and then the little ship was seen in the far distance, its triangular sail set as it tacked from side to side. As it eventually drew level, various sails were lowered, the ship slowed, and then a package was carefully thrown from the smaller ship to the larger. The package contained a message, one that the reader read with care, and a look at Asher Greyjoy that made her eyebrows contract for a long moment before she nodded, and then orders were shouted and the little flotilla set a slightly different course. When all was settled for the new course, he looked at Asher, who strode over. "My father has sent word that he will meet us at the north coast of Pike. A place called the Parlystone." He nodded, but then he caught the look on her face. "What's wrong?" She pulled a slight face. "This doesn't feel right. The Parlystone's long since lost its significance, it's a name that doesn't mean much, there's a much more important place on Great Wyck. That said, we'll keep to the plan. Plain cloaks and cowls. We'll match whatever my father means to do with means of our own." She said this with a strained smile that didn't meet her eyes, and then strode off. They sailed on, along the northern coast, as the sun started to head down towards the horizon, until they eventually reached what must have been the appointed place. There stood a great flat rock by the side of a sloping beach of grey shingle, and as they rowed ashore in long cutters, John found his eyes flickering to the headlands behind the beach. He couldn't anyone there, but that did not mean that no one was there. As he leapt ashore, Ghost at his side, he strode rapidly up the beach, joined swiftly by Theon and Mist, and then Ygritte, who looked glad to be ashore again, but not at the expense of neglecting her sentry skills. She had her bow in one hand, but then as she looked about and the direwolves sniffed the air, all three seemed to relax just a hair. She looked at him and nodded, whilst the direwolves attended to some much-needed relief now that they were both ashore. Once that was done, they both bounded off, alert in every way. By the time he looked back at the ships, the reader was sure, along with his men and Stannis Baratheon. The hand of the king had brought along half a dozen of his best men, and all had hidden their Baratheon tabards beneath plain cowled cloaks. He's heard the king's brother mutter about hating such mummery, but as the reader had pointed out, they needed to keep his presence a secret until the right moment. As one of Lord Harlaw's men bound the flag of House Harlaw to a tall pole that they had brought with them, and then walked over to the flat rock and jammed it into the shingle so that it stood upright, before wedging it in place with stones at the base, John sighed and placed a hand on Dark Sister's hilt. He really needed to give it a new name, to hide it in plain sight, but that felt vaguely wrong somehow for a sword with such a history. And then he paused. Ghost and Mist had both stopped dead in their tracks and were looking out to sea. He walked over to his direwolf, waving at Theon to do the same, and then all four stared northwards. There was nothing in sight, save a distant fogbank, but something was causing the hackles on both direwolves to ripple briefly. "What is it?" he asked Ghost, but the direwolf just tilted his head to one side as if both puzzled and disturbed, before huffing slightly and sitting and looking about. "Something's amiss," Theon said in a low voice. "I'll have a word with Asher and the reader." "Aye," he replied. "Just because we can't see trouble, that doesn't mean it's not coming." Theon strode off quickly, Mist at his side, and had that word. Asher looked bemused, but the reader nodded sharply and then talked to one of his men, who detached others to set a good watch, before glancing at John and then saying something to Theon. The new Lord Greymist had a slightly bemused look to his face when he walked back. He listened. Then he looked at me, looked at you, said you'll both do, and dismissed me. What do you think he meant by that? It means that sometimes you've got a brain in that thick skull of yours, Ygritte said to one side, and she passed them and stared at all 4 points of the compass. "There's trouble coming. You'll do." And then she walked off with a smirk at John. "Gods," Theon muttered at him. "Bed and marry her. Watching you two circle each other like a pair of Randy Stoats is getting very wearying." They waited after that. Waited for a worryingly long time, as the sun started to set and dread started to gnaw at him. He didn't know what was delaying Balon Bloody Greyjoy, but at one point he heard the reader telling Asher Greyjoy that her father was a fool, something that she did not disagree with. The reader then ordered some of his men to start gathering the driest of the driftwood to make a bonfire to one side, in case they needed the light to re-embark. But then, finally, he heard shouts to one side and looked up to see a procession of men striding along the headland and then down towards the flat rock. They held a standard before them, the banner of House Greyjoy snapping and booming in the stiff breeze, and as they approached he sent Ghost to the rear of their assembled party and then joined the others, his stark tabard hidden by his own cloak and his face obscured by his hood. As the Greyjoy party approached, two men stood out. The first was a gaunt man with long grey hair that was flecked with white and a slight stoop who wore a Greyjoy tabard. The second was shorter, with long black hair that seemed to be mixed with something else and the burning eyes of a fanatic. "Damn fair," someone breathed to one side of him, and he looked over to see Asher looking at the approaching men with a troubled gaze. And then, and farther. The Greyjoy party reached the base of the rock, and then the man with the stoop gestured at the man with the standard, who jammed it into the ground and then placed rocks at its base to match the Harlaw standard. And then what could only be Balon Greyjoy stepped forwards, the man with long hair a step behind his right-hand side. As he approached, the reader stepped forwards to greet them, Asher at his side, and then a long silence followed. The reader and Asher just stood there, whilst Balon Greyjoy glared at them almost as much as the man who had to be Aaron Greyjoy. Finally Balon Greyjoy broke the silence. "Harlaw." "My lord." The reader nodded shortly. His eyes flickered to one side. "Damn fair." Damn fair, the name was apt. Was that seaweed in his hair? Curled a lip at his good brother. "Father." Asher said the word simply and with some regret. Balon Greyjoy's nostrils flared for a moment and then he looked at her. "Daughter." Something seemed to pass between them, but interestingly enough it was he who broke their gaze as he looked back at the reader. There was another moment of silence and then the Lord of Harlaw smiled ever so slightly. "No bread and salt." Balon Greyjoy's lips twitched for a moment. "It's coming." The reader's own lips twitched. "Of course it is," he replied. "You requested this meeting. What say you?" The long-haired man drew himself up. "I am the Lord of the Iron Islands." He barked the words. "I know," the reader replied. "I have never denied that fact." "And you have taken up arms against me." The reader tilted his head to one side slightly. "Did not your people take up arms against us when they started murdering those who said that they had heard the call?" An unpleasant silence was the result of this, as Balon Greyjoy looked angry and his brother looked as if he was about to start raving, only to be held back with a wave of the former's hand. "The call," Balon Greyjoy snarled eventually, "is naught but Greenlander mummery and—" The reader cut him off. "Was there a Greenlander in my study when I heard the words 'the others come'? The Stark calls for aid. You are needed." "No, there was not." "Harris." A dark-haired younger man with Harlaw colours stepped forwards. "My lord." "Where were you when you heard the call, nephew?" "At sea, my lord." "Any Greenlanders with you?" "Not a one, my lord." Red spots burned in Balon Greyjoy's cheeks for a moment. "This call was—" "You heard it too, didn't you, father?" The question by Asher was direct and seemed to pierce the Lord of the Iron Islands, who deflated a little and looked about with more than a hint of uneasiness. "We are loyal to you, Lord Greyjoy," the reader said firmly. "All we wish is to help at the wall. What is the threat in that?" However, if Balon Greyjoy looked deflated, his brother was the opposite. He seemed to swell with rage. "The drowned god denies the call. The drowned god is all. No help for blasphemous Greenlanders." The reader looked at Damfair with a look of utter disgust. "Asher," he said eventually, "who did you discover is sending help to the wall?" "All of Westeros," Asher replied grimly. "From Sunspear and Highgarden to Dragonstone and Tarth. Even the Old Lion is sending help." Balon Greyjoy snorted. "That sour old bastard has to, after his children were caught fucking." But Damfair was not finished. "The call is a nonsense. A lie from Greenlanders. They're so-called old gods that do not exist. The drowned god was once one of them. We know the truth now, Damfair. I have read the runes. We know the truth. When did you suspect that your drowned god is mad and dying?" The Ironborn in Balon Greyjoy's group hissed at the apparent blasphemy, and Damfair turned a fascinating range of colors, from white with shock to red with rage that seemed to be tinted with something else. Shock. Fear. Enough. The word came from the lips of Stannis Baratheon, who stepped forwards and shrugged off his hood and cloak. Behind him his men did the same, and the Baratheon stag was visible on all their chests. Enough. I am Stannis Baratheon, the Hand of the King. I speak with his voice, and the king says this: there will be peace in the Iron Islands. There was a shocked silence, and then Balon Greyjoy raised a trembling finger. Stannis Baratheon. He hissed the name as if it pained his lips to say it. Stannis Baratheon. You seem to have heard of me, the Hand of the King said dryly. But you may call me my Lord Hand, as befits my title. The enraged Lord of the Iron Islands rounded on the reader and Asher. That's why you were at Winterfell. To bring this man with you. Stannis Baratheon, the Butcher of Fair Isle. Yes, Asher said steadily. Father, it was the only way to get you to see sense. By bringing him here. The Butcher of Fair Isle. Stop saying that, the reader snapped. I was at Fair Isle. You were not. He killed your sons. This time it was the reader who swelled with rage. No. He did not. You killed them both. You, with your insane war that you could never win. You gambled that Robert Baratheon, a man who loves war, would not be able to bring the full force of Westeros onto us. You committed us to a war that we could never win. There was a long moment of mutual hatred, and then the reader let out a breath. I, at least, will have children at some point. My wife is with child. And the Hand of the King is here to remind you that the king wishes for peace in these islands. Thank you, Lord Harlaw, Stannis Baratheon rumbled before stepping forwards, one hand resting casually on the pommel of his sword. The crown has heeded the call. The king rides for the wall, to help the Night's Watch fight the ancient enemy there. The others have returned, and they care not a whit for our squabbles. We are fighting for each other, and if you think that the others do not care about you here, then you are wrong. The Iron Throne will look favorably on those who help in the north. It will look askance at those who do not or who hinder it. Balon Greyjoy looked from the hand to the reader and then back again, his face working through a number of emotions. Father Asher said quietly, I have been to Winterfell. I've seen the king there. And I've seen things that you need to know about. The shades of the dead gathered at Barrowtown, until Ned Stark and his son bade them to leave. Strange fog gathered at Harlaw and vanished at the same time that the dead were dismissed in Barrowtown. Father, magic has returned. The others are out there. As your heir, I urge you to see reason on this. As my heir. Daughter, you presume much. And strictly speaking, Theon is still my heir. No, he is not. Stannis Baratheon said the words flatly. Asher is now your heir. Balon Greyjoy did not blanch at this. He did not curse or wince. He simply flicked an eyebrow up and down. Ned Stark took his head then. Well, he was a hostage after all. The words were said in such an indifferent way that Jon blinked and then bristled. Theon was not his friend in the way that he was Robb's, but he was closer to the new Lord Greymist than he had been before. No, and now it was Theon's turn to shed his hood and cloak, before clicking his fingers and summoning mist. He could have, after finding out that you rebuilt the Iron Fleet. But he did not. Instead, I have renounced my Ironborn heritage. I am Lord Greymist now, of the North. The blood drained from the face of Balon Greyjoy as his men muttered behind him. Finally he rallied enough to say, Theon. Father. Theon replied flatly. Did you hesitate about my fate for a moment before you ordered the rebuilding of the Iron Fleet? Was my life, the life of your last living son, worth nothing to you? His eyes were blazing and his father could not meet them for long. We had to be strong, he muttered eventually. If you are truly Ironborn, then you'd understand. What I understand is that my father abandoned me to my fate as a hostage. He looked down at Mist and then back up again. So why should I not abandon my father's name? I am Lord Greymist of the North. I am a man, a lord of the North. A dog to the Starks, Balon sneered. Good then that you ran away from your heritage. You are indeed no Greyjoy, boy. And I see that you have a dog of your own. He's a direwolf. And Lord Stark has been a better father than you ever were. And have you abandoned the drowned god? Damfair shook his head in disgust. Your father is right, it is better that you are lost to us. The drowned god. Theon almost spat the words. The old god saved me from him. You see this? He pulled out the weirwood pendant from his shirt. They gave me this after I dreamt that my brother Roderick tried to drag me to him. I dreamt of an island made from bones, set in a sea of the dead. Roderick was dead and rotting, but he was still alive in some way that I don't understand, and he wanted me to meet this thing that stank of madness on a throne by the shoreline. I killed Roderick and the thing chased me onto a boat where I was saved after I chose the old gods. Another silence fell, with many of the men muttering behind Balon Greyjoy, who had an odd expression on his face, as if he was troubled. Damfair on the other side had gone as white as a sheet. An island made from bones, boy. He croaked the word slowly. And, a smell. A stink of foulness, Theon said softly. And I woke up to find this pendant around my neck. It was more than a dream. I don't fully understand it even now, but I follow the old gods. Damfair fell silent and stared at Theon as if he was not sure what he was, whilst Balon Greyjoy just stood there, his face still working, until he finally groaned and then rubbed his hands over his face. Oh, he said slowly, very clever, Harlaw. Well played. Well played indeed. Asher is now my heir, Theon is lost to me, and you have forced the truce on your terms, not mine. I have played nothing, the reader said, tilting his head to one side. This is all the work of others. And of you. You were the one who denied the call. You were the one whose orders broke the Iron Fleet. And you were the one who wanted this parley. The Lord of the Iron Islands just looked at him and then stared at the sea. When he looked back, Jon could tell that something had broken within the man. He clicked his own fingers, and as Ghost padded out from behind everyone, he could see that Balon Greyjoy was looking at him. Another direwolf. Who are you then? He undid the cloak and showed the Stark tabard on his chest. Jon Stark. Here to bear witness for your father. I. Well now, the bastard of Winterfell is here as well. My humiliation is complete. He did not rise to the bait. Instead he just repressed his temper and placed a hand on Theon's shoulder. The North has welcomed Lord Greymist. Balon Greyjoy's lip curled, and then a pair of hands came together in a clap of delight off to one side. Ah! To be present at such a moment. House Greyjoy and attendant dogs and vermin united in one place. I'd cry if I could, but that's no longer possible for me. The speaker was a slender bearded man with long black hair and an eye patch over his left eye. The right eye was blue and it shone with malice and amusement, whilst for some reason the man's lips were blue. And he was alone. Standing there dressed in black leather breeches and a white shirt under a black leather doublet, but alone, with just a short sword and a dagger on his belt. Crow's Eye. The reader hissed the words, before looking at Balon Greyjoy. I was warned he had returned from his exile. Why is he here? Asher had one hand on her sword and all of the reader's men were looking alert. Jon remembered what Asher had said of her mad uncle and placed his own hand on the hilt of Dark Sister. Balon Greyjoy shook his head. Brother. Things have changed. Leave. Euron Greyjoy threw his head back and laughed. Oh, Balon. Did you really think that I am here to help you? That your poor pathetic plan to force a peace on these miserable pile of iron-rich rocks was ever what I wanted? You always were a fool. Everyone stared at him, Ironborn and Mainlander, in confusion. Eventually the man stopped laughing and looked at his oldest brother. I'm here to kill you. A languid hand waved at the others. All of you actually. I am here for power, the kind of power that you can't even begin to understand. You are all beneath me now. Jon stared at him, confused, and then at the horizon in all directions. There was no threat that he could see. Is he mad? Whoever asked the question was speaking what he was thinking. Euron Greyjoy walked forwards a step. Damn fair. Why don't you explain to everyone why you're so worried about your dying god? Yes, I see that look in your eyes, that look of utter panic. You know as well I do that he's dying as he clings to that ledge and begs for scraps from our tables. A rape here, a murder there, a curse, crumbs to feed a dying creature. A look of false pity crossed his face. We should put him out of his misery, surely. Is that not the right thing to do? The look was replaced with one of mad glee. But the opportunity that would emerge. When he dies, a void would be there, a void that can be filled. A new god. A young, virile god. The grin somehow grew wider. Me. He's mad, Grit stated very firmly. He's out of his mind. Euron Greyjoy frowned slightly as he looked at her. A wilderling. Here? How odd. And then he fixed his eye on Jon. A Stark. He said the last word flatly, with something in his voice that might have been a tremor of uncertainty. A Stark. A meddling Stark, full of rectitude and honor and without any idea of how to use the magic in your veins from your child of the forest ancestors. Jon blinked at the man. What? But then the one-eyed man waved a hand. Irrelevant. You die today. You all die today and I take a step towards achieving my goal. Bold words from just one man, the reader said with narrowed eyes. Where is your crew? The question seemed to amuse the lunatic. My crew. My crew are assisting me as only I know how to use them properly. You'd be amazed at what I have picked up from places like Valyria. For a moment a shadow seemed to cross his face before another languid wave of the hand dismissed that as a topic. I have help coming from another place. He looked at the sea and then sighed slightly. They are so annoying. No proper sense of timing. Well, what can you expect from such creatures? The hairs on the back of Jon's neck stood up at the same time that he felt Ghost's hackles go up. The fog bank off the coast was drawing closer and all of a sudden he felt colder. What have you done? What have I done? Well, I have allied myself to creatures that want to kill everyone on these islands for a start. He paused. They're a bit fixated on that point and not very bright. Such a shame for them, but then I'm going to betray them anyway and use the magic within them once they are done killing you all. He looked back at the sea. Ah. At last. The fog bank was heading straight towards them and all of a sudden mist was howling a warning. Jon and Theon both drew their swords and following their lead so did Stannis Baratheon and the reader as they all stepped backwards from the shore. Balon Greyjoy looked confused, whilst Damfair was white and shaking and as they breathed out white vapor was suddenly appearing. It was colder than it had been before. Far colder. Jon and Theon swapped a horrified glance of recognition and then the latter sheathed his sword and unslung his bow from his back and scrabbled into his quiver. Grit. How many dragonglass arrowheads do you have? Not many, the wilderling girl muttered as she readied her own bow. Didn't think that we'd need them here. Jon Stark. What's going on? Stannis Baratheon barked. Others. Jon bellowed. The madman's allied himself with the others. But we're hundreds of miles south of the wall. How can they be here? He shivered slightly. This is the stroke we were warned of. He looked back at the fog bank. It was shredding now and then he saw it. A huge iceberg was coming straight at them, awake somehow at its front as it cut through the waves in a path as straight as an arrow. They went around the bloody wall. Icebergs don't normally do that, the reader spat. To arms. Lord Hand, Jon Stark, what should we do? Light that fire. Throw lamp oil onto it. We need fire. Stannis Baratheon roared. How many dragonglass arrows do you have available, Lord Greymist? As someone thrust a brand into the pile of driftwood and another man ransacked a backpack for lamp oil, Theon conferred with Ygritte and then looked back at the Hand. 10 between us, my Lord Hand. If there's more than 10 others or whites in that thing, we are fucked. Valyrian steel will help, Jon barked. Who here wields Valyrian steel? Harrows. The reader shouted. Please tell me you have nightfall on you. I do, uncle. Harrows Harlaw, a tall man with an austere face, stepped forwards and, after a wave of the hand from his uncle, joined Jon with a nod of recognition for his own Valyrian steel sword. Don't be overwhelmed by how they look, Jon muttered to the Ironborn. It's going to get colder than you've ever been before. Avoid their swords, they cut through anything but Valyrian steel. He looked back to the confused mass of men behind the Lord of the Iron Islands. Pull back. There are monsters like you've never seen coming. The iceberg ground its way towards them and as it came closer Jon could see shapes in the ice, indistinct but still just visible, and then he saw the top of the mountain of ice. It was almost as clear as glass and within it he could see 3 figures within it, seated on thrones made from blue ice. Their eyes were open and shone with the malicious blue fire that he had seen north of the wall. Others. There were others somehow here. Euron. Damfair screamed the word. What have you done? Treachery. Blasphemy. Euron Greyjoy grinned at his brother, who was walking towards him, raving and waving his arms in the air. Damfair seemed to be out of his mind, screeching words and phrases about the drowned god and faith. Jon opened his mouth to warn the Ironborn fanatic, and then Euron, with the speed of a striking snake, whipped out his short sword and darted forwards to bury it in the belly of his brother. At last he said as he stared into the eyes of the white-faced Damfair. "I've been planning to do that since I was 7 years old. You always were annoying. Now, tell that mad god of yours that I'm coming for his skinny ass in the gate at the High Tower." There was a moment of shocked silence, broken only by the grinding shriek of the iceberg forcing its way onto the beach, and then as Euron pulled his sword out, Damfair screamed in pain and then fell to the ground, trying weakly to stuff his entrails back into his stomach. "Madman!" Asher shouted in horror. "Kinslayer!" Euron waved his sword negligently, spattering his brother with his own blood. "Oh, kinslaying's the least of what I'm going to do to all of you, especially you," he leered at her. "I have plans for your white cunt." Asher narrowed her eyes. "Not whilst I have breath in my body, you mad fucker." "That's the point," Asher, her uncle, laughed. "That's the point. You won't have a say in anything." "Aha!" At last. The iceberg came to a halt, and then suddenly the top of it seemed to shiver and then shatter as the three figures stood up from their thrones. White hair whipped in the wind as those inhuman eyes gazed down at them all, and the lead other raised his sword into the sky and then brought it down into the ice beneath its feet. The ice cracked as a fissure speared its way through the iceberg, and then the front of it shattered and the whites that had been trapped within it emerged, climbing over the ice and then surging towards the horrified onlookers. "Stand and fight!" Stannis Baratheon bellowed as he got his men into line, joined quickly by the reader. Among Balon Greyjoy's men, however, chaos reigned. "What are those things?" was the most common words on the lips of the men behind him. "Whites." "Stand and fight!" Stannis bellowed. "I stand with the hand." The reader shouted. "Stand with the hand and the reader." The words seemed to shake the men into action, because swords were drawn and the men came forwards to meet the onrushing pack of whites. There had to be at least 60 of the bastards, maybe more, and Jon swallowed as they came on before adding his own voice to the bedlam. "Crush their skulls. Hack their heads off. Cut them to pieces." Bows sang behind him and 2 whites stopped in their tracks and then fell where they stood, arrows standing out from their chests. "They can die," Theon shouted. "Dragon glass kills them." "Where the fuck are we going to get dragon glass on this bloody beach?" someone shouted. "Brands. Use brands. Set fire to the whites. Lamp oil. Use lamp oil." That was Ygritte, the most experienced white fighter they had, and as he watched she darted forwards and thrust her dagger into the eye of a charging white, which crumpled at her feet. Dragon glass. She had her dragon glass dagger. She caught his look. "Did you really think I'd go anywhere without that dagger, Jon Stark?" And with that she grabbed her other dragon glass dagger and gave to the reader, who took it with a grim nod. Another white came at Jon and he felled it with a blow, before stepping back and watching as Harris Harlaw swept the head off a white and then plunged his sword into its chest, kicking the stiffening body off and then staring down in horror as the arms of fallen whites killed by the others still reached for him. "Cut them to pieces." Jon snarled as he killed another white with a blow. Others were doing the same, and to one side a white went up in flames, and then another. The group around Stannis Baratheon and the reader were doing better than the men around Balon Greyjoy. Someone had pulled him back and there were unmoving Ironborn laying dead on the shoreline, mingled in with the still moving parts of whites. And then the others moved, leaping down from the iceberg to land as lightly as cats on the shoreline. The lead white raised his sword again, and then suddenly the dead Ironborn were standing, eyes blue as they raised their weapons against the living Ironborn. Someone screamed in fear and then Jon looked to one side. Damfair was standing again, no walking, his entrails dragging on the ground at his feet and behind him. But then a bow sang again and suddenly Damfair was falling again, this time forever with a dragon glass-tipped arrow in his chest. "Rest, Uncle," Theon said with weary sorrow. "Ygritte. How many arrows do you have?" "3. I have 2. "Jon, we need to kill the others." "I." Jon roared, before grabbing Harris Harlaw by the arm. "Come with me." The pale iron-born man tried to protest, but then the reader paused from stabbing his stone dagger into the eye of a wight and nodded. Harris. Go with him. Gods, thought John as the two rushed forwards, we need Robb and Ice. He slashed at a passing wight and then stopped and readied himself as the three others came towards them, long white hair blowing in the wind. Bows sang behind him and the others ducked the arrows, one coming with the span of a man's hand from hitting the right-hand creature. To one side John could see Ghost hamstringing any wights that he could, whilst Mist did the same to one side. Shit, John muttered, and then the leading other raised his sword against his, an almost bored look on its face. That bored look vanished the moment that John parried the blow with Dark Sister and then slashed at its face. Harris Harlaw took on another other with the same result and John's heart lifted slightly. The Iron-born man was good, very good. But this was the first time that he'd fought another. John hammered at the icy blade of his opponent and then feinted one way whilst rolling his wrists and then slashing downwards. The Valyrian steel slashed into the leg of the other, which then blew apart in a wales of ice and snow, followed rapidly by the rest of the other. But John had no time to celebrate. Harris Harlaw screamed suddenly and then staggered. John threw him a glance and then groaned. The upper half of a wight had grabbed his leg and was savaging it with its teeth. The distraction was just what the other that the Ironborn had been fighting needed. The blade of ice caught Harris Harlaw in the neck, severing the man's jugular, and he fell choking on his own blood, nightfall slipping from his hands. Harris! The reader shouted in real anguish. Shit, John said again, before ducking under a blow from one of the two others and then darting down to pick up Nightfall. Lord Harlaw! Catch! The blade flew through the air and the reader judged its flight with care and then snatched it up before taking his place at John's side. There was a blooded scratch down his face, but he had a face like stone as he looked at the creature that had killed his nephew and heir. And then he swung into action at the same time as John, hacking at the ice swords with a terrible fury. The reader. Men called from behind them and then John heard the sound of shattering crockery and then the sound of oil igniting. Stand with the hand and the reader. The leading other started to raise a hand, obviously to raise more wights again, but John jabbed at it and then pressed it back, before finally getting in a killing blow on its head. The other vanished in a blizzard of ice and then its companion joined it in death when the reader took its hand off at the wrist and then stabbed Nightfall into its chest. All around them John could hear the slithering thumps of wights collapsing, no longer animated by the fell magics of their creators, and John could hear the glad cries coming from their companions, or what was left of them. The reader's men had been joined by some of the crew from his ship, who had brought more oil, who all looked shaken but jubilant. The Ironborn of Pike on the other hand were hushed and shaken, all looking down the bodies that covered the ground in front of them, many horribly fresh. Well, now, even my good brother will have to admit that others and their wights exist now, the reader said with a certain sadness in his voice. He looked down at the body of his nephew. At what cost though? He frowned. What do we do with the bodies? Burn them all, John replied. If there's another other out there, if this wasn't the only blow against us, they could be raised again. We can't take the chance. Well fought, Stannis Baratheon said as he cleaned his blade. Where's Euron Greyjoy though? Well, fuck, said a voice to one side, and the three raised their blades as they saw the languid form of the exiled Greyjoy. That did not go as I had foreseen. You, Euron Greyjoy, will pay for your treachery, Stannis Baratheon said through clenched teeth. To ally yourself with others. Oh, please, you couldn't kill me if you even tried. And then he seemed to almost flicker, moving almost too fast to see. John cried out in alarm, but it was too late. Euron Greyjoy appeared like a grim wraith in front of his older brother and then pulled a dagger from his belt, plunged it into the stomach of Balon Greyjoy and twisted it, whilst grinning into his face. Goodbye, brother. And then he ran again, heading straight for the sea. Chaos erupted again as Balon Greyjoy started to scream. Theon loosed what must have been one of his normal arrows at his uncle, but the man moved like a snake, dodging with ease, before vanishing behind a rock. Men hurtled after him in pursuit but then paused and looked about. Where'd he fucking go? Asked one. John ran to the rock and looked about. The man was indeed gone. Set guards. Watch for him. Aye, my lord, one of the men said, obviously glad to have an order. John looked about again in the gathering dark. Ghost was at his side, whilst Theon had missed by him as he stood and watched as a pale Asher helped to tend to their screaming father. The reader and the hand strode over to him. "This isn't over, is it?" The reader shook his head. "No. We need to send warning to the other islands of what happened here. And then we prepare for this war on the wall." He looked at the bodies everywhere. "I have a bad feeling about this." And then he strode off to help. Chapter 49. Chapter text. Sorry for the delay in posting this, it's been a rather odd month. Arya. It was almost boring in Winterfell at the moment. The king was fun to watch from a distance and she'd certainly learned some fun new words from him. He sometimes seemed to have only one volume, words that mother would probably be horrified that she knew. Not that she really understood what some of them meant. She had the feeling that growing up might involve complicated things about people's bodies and sweat. Yora. In the meantime, as she sat on a bench in a courtyard in the sunshine, Nymeria asleep at her feet, Winterfell was sort of normal, if normal involved some very odd people here and there, some people who scared her a bit and others who made her laugh when she shouldn't. She knew that Ned Umber had been sent there to meet her and perhaps start to woo her a bit, or something that led to wooing. Just thinking about that made her giggle. Ned Umber was a little boy and he'd been soon sucked into the terrible threesome, making them the fearsome, or foolish in her eyes, foursome. Shireen soon had him under her thumb. She liked Shireen. She knew that she'd grown up with grayscale, something that made her shiver a bit. There were stories about that. Nasty ones. But now the old gods had saved her. And that made her shiver in a slightly different way. She'd seen red fire in the eyes of Father and of Jon. And the old gods had seen her. There were times when she wondered what they'd made of her. They'd called her a warg, and she knew she was one now. Did they have a plan for her? Or Father? Or Robb? Robb was being very grouchy recently, whilst staring at Val a lot when he obviously thought that she wasn't looking. And Val was doing the same to him. It was like watching two cats circling each other from a distance. Mother said that it was possible that Val was an Umber. And that her mother was due to arrive that day, or maybe tomorrow. And that Mors Umber, that one-eyed scary giant of a man, might be Val's grandfather. Now, he was both scary and funny. There were times when he looked at her and seemed to look right through her and wince. It might be the fact that she apparently looked a bit like Aunt Lyanna, who had died long before she'd been born. Nymeria whiffled her whiskers in her sleep and then rolled over slightly. Frankly, it made no sense to her if Val was part Umber, then why didn't Robb just marry her and stop mooning about like an idiot? He liked her, she liked him, they'd helped the Hound kill the Mountain, a man who had truly scared her, so why couldn't they just get it over with and be happy? Why were older people so stupid? And for that matter, why was Septa Mordane so weird these days? She'd heard the call, she knew what was coming, why didn't she just accept it like Mother had? It was something to do with religion. Silly. Bran's suggestion that perhaps the seven that are one had been old gods who got lost in Andalos had not gone down well, which was odd, because it made perfect sense to her. Well, the Septa was still teaching them, but also spent time in the Godswood and also in the September. People were odd. Movement caught her eye and she looked over to see Robb stalking about the courtyard, grey wind at his side. He seemed to be looking for something, but she had no idea what. Perhaps Bran should talk to him about that door in the crypts that they could only see when watching. Perhaps Robb already knew. Nymeria woke suddenly, shook herself and then looked at her expectantly. She wondered why for a moment and then she sniffed the air. Ah. Pork chops. Lunch. She grinned at her direwolf and then stood up and led her off to the kitchens, with Nymeria doing what she had termed the wag of hope. Jaime. It was a fine day. Nor warm, but the sun was shining. He was standing on a balcony overlooking the training yard, his hands on the wooden railing, and he had to face facts. It was long past time that he did so, but he really couldn't put it off any longer. His son was an idiot. He sighed as he watched the lad get knocked on his ass for the third time in as many minutes. Thorne had paired him against a scrawny lad from the Reach, who had arms like twigs and a tendency to make the same mistake many times in a row. And he was thrashing an increasingly dismayed Joffrey. Gods! If Baratheon could see them now, he'd piss himself laughing. He forced his eyes away from the sad spectacle, and then he realized that the old bear was approaching him with a look of resolve on his face. "You need to do something about the lad," Mormont rumbled. "I can tell that Thorn regards him as shit on the bottom of his boot already." The raven on his shoulder caught almost derisively, as if he disgusted it. He could tell at once that he was right. The thin-faced man was regarding Joffrey with utter contempt written all over his face, before shaking his head and looking away. "Break!" Thorn shouted. "Catch your breath. And wipe that mud off your ass, Hill." Jaime ran his hand over his face as Joffrey slumped against a bench and looked around him. Their eyes met for a moment, but then he made himself look away. Gods! Boots sounded on boards, and he looked to one side to see that Thorn had joined them. The Master of Arms at Castle Black looked at him with a sneer and then jerked a thumb in the general direction of Joffrey. "Gods almighty, who taught that little shit? He holds a sword like it's a bloody rolling pin, and he'd do about as much damage." "The Hound Sander Clegane." Jaime shrugged a little. "The problem is that the boy never listened. He was always looking around for the nearest pretty girl or thinking up new lion-related names for his sword." Thorn curled a lip in his direction. "He doesn't bloody listen even now." And Mormont growled, "Every now and then he keeps telling people he's a prince. Is he a lackwit? The boy's a bastard." The boy represented his utter dishonor, but Jaime could not bring himself to say that. "I'll talk to him," he said after a long moment. "I'll try and knock some sense into him." "Good," said Thorn, "because if you don't I will, and I'll beat some sense into him. No man of the Night's Watch in his right mind would want that little shit by his side when the others bring their whites to the wall. Not the way he is now. Talk to your son, Kingslayer. Now." His fingers clenched on the rail he was gripping. "I was never his father," he said dully after a long moment. "Oh, I was the one who quickened his mother, but I could never be his father. He sees me as his uncle. I don't think that he'll really accept me as his father. He still thinks that Robert Baratheon fathered him." "Then fucking well educate him then," Thorn snarled at him. "Because he'll not last long here otherwise. They laugh at him now. They won't do that for much longer. And as I said, I'd love to beat some sense into him, but Tywin Lannister is on his way to the wall with the king, and he'd be unamused if he saw that his grandson had a black eye and was missing some teeth." "Ah. They really didn't understand father, did they?" He sighed again and then placed a hand on the pouch around his neck. "Father was coming, and the king and Sir Barristan bloody sell me." And once again he was going to be reminded about how badly he had disgraced his family and besmirched his honor. The pouch. He tightened his grip for an instant and then he nodded, slowly and tiredly. This was going to be unpleasant. So he strode down to the courtyard and stood in front of his son. "Joffrey. Come with me now." A complicated expression crossed the boy's face, a combination of surprise and glee and dread. Jaime repressed the need to sigh yet again and ushered him to the lift that led up to the wall, and once up there he found a quiet place with no watchers. But then as he turned to look at him, Joffrey burst out with words that sent his heart into his boots. "Uncle Jaime. Are you here to explain your plan to get us out of here?" "Plan?" Joffrey stared at him as if he was mad. "To get us out of this hellhole." He counted to 10 in his head. And then he cuffed the back of his son's head. Joffrey yelped and reeled from him. "Uncle! How dare you strike me? I am a... You are not a prince, Joffrey. Not anymore. Don't you understand this? This isn't a game, or a plot on the part of Stark and Stannis Baratheon. We are here and we deserve to be here, don't you understand that?" There was a total lack of comprehension behind those green eyes that were in front of him. He groaned internally and then finally said the words that had been haunting him. "Joffrey, it's true. I betrayed 2 kings, one for the right reasons and one for the wrong ones. You tried to kill Robb Stark. We were sent here for reasons, Joffrey, not whatever nonsense your mother poured into your ear like poison. We are here and we will live here and we will die here. There's no way out of this." "But uncle. I am not your uncle. I am your father." There, the fatal word had been spoken. He could see the denial in Joffrey's eyes, the incomprehension. "You know this, your grandfather told you, Robert Baratheon told you and I am telling you now. I am your father. I loved my own sister and committed incest with her, and the result was you and your sister and your brother. So, you are not a prince, you never were a prince, not really. You're my son. You're a bastard. And I'm sorry that you're here. But here we are, at the end of the world, where we'll have to fight monsters that want us all dead. The wind whistled harshly past them as they stood there, on top of the wall. And it was there that he saw something die in the eyes of his son. I was going to be king one day. The boy whispered the words as he stared past Jaime's right shoulder with dull eyes. Well, now you won't be. You'll never be. Just a black brother with me, if we survive this war that's coming here to the wall. Now listen to me, accept this fate. You have no choice. If you keep clinging to this fantasy that you are still a prince, then the nods you see, with the grins that they hide from you behind their hands, will become sneers and later anger, before you have an accident here at the top of the wall and get discovered dead at its base. Now, I will train you and you will learn. Not whine, not complain, learn. Try and remember what the Hound told you. And forget ideas of escape. We cannot escape this. We cannot escape the reckoning for what we have done and what we are. Joffrey's face worked for a long moment and then he burst into tears and sat down with a sudden abruptness. And with a bewildered sense of confusion, Jaime stood there next to him and patted him on the head, uncertain what to do. He was a father and he had not the faintest idea how to act like one. And as he looked to the north, at the forest that stretched ahead to the horizon, he felt a sudden shiver of dread. Something was coming. Coming for all of them. Jon Stark. Balon Greyjoy may have been a sour piece of utter shit, but he took a day to die. The wound to his stomach was fatal and the maester at Pike had to judge the amount of the milk of the poppy to administer very carefully, as he didn't want to kill him, but Balon Greyjoy's screaming never seemed to end for that day. It was a day he remembered for some time, a day etched in his memory. A horrible day. Pike was a place that defied description at times. The castle was, in pieces. It was, on its seaward side, a series of towers sitting on stacks of stone, linked by stone arches or rope bridges. Just looking at the bloody place gave him the creeping horrors. Apparently the original Pike had been on a headland. Now that headland was just a group of islands. How long would it be before the islands went as well? Asher Greyjoy had told him that a lot of stones and mortar were used in areas at low tide at times. If he had been in charge, then he would have told them to start placing huge rocks at the base of the islands and to keep placing them until the headland reappeared. Something else that gave him the creeping horrors were the people in Pike. Oh, Asher and the reader had taken the place by the scruff of the neck and shaken it good and hard, helped by the death of Damfair and the wounding of Balon Greyjoy by his mad brother. Everyone had united in anger and fury over that. And as the word went around of what Euron had said, there had been a lot of muttering. Damfair's drowned men had been dismissed at once. They had not exactly gone willingly, but their hearts had been in the boots once word of Damfair's death and word of Euron's babblings about the drowned god being dying had gone around. But the thing that was really haunting him was the looks that various people were giving him or not giving him. Many of the servants were afraid of Ghost, but they were all unable to look him in the eye. Not him, not Theon, not any member of their party. They seemed to be afraid of something. And having talked to Stannis Baratheon beforehand, he knew what that something was. They were thrall slaves in all but name. Some had been taken in raids on the mainland before or during the Greyjoy rebellion. Some were hopefully descended from those who had been taken in the raids, because they looked rather young. And some, upon hearing the northern accent of some of their party, had looked as if they wanted to say something but were too terrified to say a word. Apparently the reader had had a word with a few people, but it still all made him very angry. And now, as they sat there in a dining room of the Great Hall of Pike and awaited the latest news, he was looking at a thrall pouring his wine who would not look at his face and who trembled a little, but whose face worked slightly whenever he said a word. "You're of the north," he said to her as quietly as possible. "Taken in a raid." She froze in place, not looking at him, just down at the goblet she was pouring the wine into. She said eventually in the tiniest of voices. "Taken. You can go home now. My word as a Stark." Her eyes flickered at him and then closed for a long moment. "Truly? Truly?" A tear leaked out of the one eye that he could see of her frozen profile, and then she drew herself up and nodded formally. "Honor to serve House Stark. I heard the call." And then she looked about the room, her face working, and all but fled. Theon looked at him and then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Another taken from the north. Fuck their iron price. And fuck their old ways. No slaves. Not now, not ever." Lord Greymist's voice wobbled about a bit from emotion, but it was intense. "There'll be those that fight it," said the voice of the reader to one side, making them both start a little in surprise. "But then there's always idiots out there that fight traditions being stopped. And any tradition that boosts the mad thing that is the drowned god needs to bloody well stop." There was a moment of silence, and then they both nodded at Lord Harlaw, before sitting there